The telegram crumpled in Eleanor's trembling hand as she stood alone on the dusty platform of Silver Creek Depot, her trunk beside her like a tombstone marking the death of her dreams. The man who'd promised her marriage, a home, a future, had vanished without a trace, leaving her stranded 2,000 miles from Boston with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of betrayal. As the last train's whistle faded into the Montana wilderness, a shadow fell across her tear-stained face. A weathered cowboy stood before her, his voice cutting through her despair. "Ma'am, looks like you could use some help." Before we begin this tale of heartbreak turned to hope, I invite you to follow Eleanor's journey from abandonment to unexpected love. Comment below which city you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story of the American frontier has traveled. The spring sun of 1876 cast long shadows across the Silver Creek Depot platform as Eleanor Parker pressed her gloved hand against her chest, trying to still her racing heart. The telegram from the station master felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in her other hand, each word a nail in the coffin of her carefully constructed future. "I'm terribly sorry, miss. The station master, a portly man named Hollis with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, said softly, "I've asked around town for 3 days now. Nobody's heard of a Thomas Whitmore, and there ain't no Whitmore ranch within 50 miles of here. I checked with the land office myself." Eleanor's legs threatened to give way beneath her burgundy traveling dress, the finest she owned, chosen specifically to impress the man she was supposed to marry. She gripped the edge of the ticket window for support, her knuckles white beneath her lace gloves. "But his letters," she whispered, her voice catching. 23 letters over 8 months. He described the ranch, the cattle, the view of the mountains from the front porch where we'd sit together in the evenings. He sent me money for the train fare. Hollis shifted uncomfortably, his boots scraping against the wooden planks. "Miss Parker, I hate to say it, but it wouldn't be the first time some scoundrel lured a respectable woman out here with false promises. These mining towns and frontier settlements, they attract all sorts." The truth of his words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She closed her eyes, seeing Thomas's handwriting in her mind. Elegant, educated, full of poetry and promises. How could words that had seemed so sincere be nothing but elaborate lies? Is there anyone you can telegraph back east?" Hollis asked gently. "Family who might send you fare for the return journey?" Eleanor's bitter laugh escaped before she could stop it. "Family? Mr. Hollis, I sold everything I owned to make this journey. My position as a governess, my few pieces of jewelry from my late mother, even my books, all gone. My uncle made it clear when I left Boston against his wishes that I was no longer welcome in his home. He said I was a fool to trust a man I'd never met, and I suppose, her voice broke. I suppose he was right. She thought of Uncle Clarence's cold gray eyes, the way he'd turned his back on her at the Boston station. "You make your bed. You lie in it, Eleanor," he'd said. "Don't come crying to me when this fantasy of yours crumbles." The depot had grown quiet around them. The last train of the day had departed an hour ago, its smoke long dissipated into the clear Montana sky. The few passengers who'd disembarked had been met by waiting families or had purposefully stridden toward the town proper. Only Eleanor remained, a statue of abandonment in burgundy wool. "The Hayworth boarding house might," Hollis began, but Eleanor shook her head. "I have exactly 47 cents to my name, Mr. Hollis. I doubt that would cover even one night's lodging." The station master rubbed his whiskered jaw, clearly distressed. "Miss, you can't just stay here on the platform. It ain't safe, especially after dark. These frontier towns, they're rough places. A lady alone." Eleanor understood what he wasn't saying. She'd already noticed the hungry looks from some of the men who'd passed through the depot. Without protection, without money, without connections, she was vulnerable in ways that made her stomach clench with fear. "Perhaps," she began, then stopped. Perhaps what? She could offer to work for her keep, but she'd already seen how the saloon girls were regarded in the brief glimpse she'd had of Silver Creek's main street. That wasn't a path she could take, no matter how desperate her circumstances. The sun was sinking lower, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. It would have been beautiful if it hadn't felt like a countdown to catastrophe. Eleanor picked up her trunk, heavy with the trousseau she'd sewn with her own hands, the linens and clothes for a married life that would never be, and moved to one of the benches under the depot's overhanging roof. "Miss Parker," Hollis said, wringing his hands, "I get off duty in an hour. I wish I could offer you shelter, but my wife, she's particular about propriety, and taking in an unmarried woman—" "I understand," Eleanor said quietly, though understanding and accepting were two different things entirely. "Thank you for your efforts to find Thomas. At least now I know the truth." Hollis retreated to his office, occasionally peering out at her through the window with worry etched across his features. Eleanor sat rigidly on the bench, her hands folded in her lap, trying to think through her options with a mind that felt frozen with shock. She could try to find work, but what skills did she have that would be valued here? She could read and write, speak a little French, play the piano, and manage a household, accomplishments that meant something in Boston's middle-class circles, but seemed laughably useless in a frontier mining town. She had no relatives to turn to except Uncle Clarence, and she'd rather starve than prove him right by begging for his help. The sound of spurs on wood made her look up. A cowboy was walking along the platform, leading his horse toward the water trough at the far end. Eleanor quickly looked away, not wanting to invite any interaction, but she could feel his gaze on her. Her fingers tightened on her small reticule, though what protection her few remaining coins and her mother's handkerchief could offer, she didn't know. The cowboy watered his horse, a beautiful bay mare with a white star on her forehead, then tied the reins to the hitching post. Instead of leaving as Eleanor hoped, he walked back toward her, his footsteps measured and deliberate. She kept her eyes fixed on the distant mountains, pretending not to notice his approach. "Pardon me, ma'am," a deep voice said, and Eleanor had no choice but to look up. The man standing before her was perhaps 35, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of sage honey. His clothes were dusty but well-maintained, dark trousers, a blue shirt, leather vest, and a wide-brimmed hat he now held in his hands. There was something in his bearing that spoke of quiet strength rather than the swaggering bravado she'd observed in many of the men here. "James McAllister, ma'am," he said, not stepping any closer, maintaining a respectful distance that Eleanor appreciated. "I don't mean to intrude, but Hollis mentioned you might be in some difficulty, said you'd come out to meet someone who wasn't what he claimed to be." Heat flooded Eleanor's cheeks. Of course, her humiliation was already the talk of the town, the foolish Eastern woman who'd fallen for a confidence man's scheme. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. McAllister," she said stiffly, "but my circumstances are my own affair." He nodded, not seeming offended by her cold tone. "That's true enough, ma'am, but Silver Creek ain't no place for a lady alone after dark and the sun's about to set. I've got a sister runs a respectable boarding house in Willow Springs, that's about 40 miles west. She's always looking for help, someone educated who can keep books, maybe teach the local children their letters. Room and board included, and fair wages besides." Eleanor studied his face, looking for signs of deception or ulterior motives. After Thomas's betrayal, how could she trust anyone? "And why would you concern yourself with a stranger's troubles, Mr. McAllister?" A shadow crossed his features. "Let's say I've seen what happens to decent folks when they get caught in desperate circumstances out here. My sister Margaret, she came out as a mail-order bride 5 years back. Lucky for her, the man was honest and they're happy now, but—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "I've seen it go the other way too many times. Good women destroyed by the harshness of this place, by men who see them as nothing more than, well—" He pulled something from his vest pocket, a leather wallet worn soft with use. "The evening train to Willow Springs comes through in 2 hours. Tickets $3.50. He placed 4 silver dollars on the bench beside Eleanor, careful not to touch her or crowd her space. "That'll get you there with enough left for a meal on the way." Eleanor stared at the coins, their surface gleaming in the dying light. "I can't accept charity, Mr. McAllister." "It ain't charity," he said firmly. "It's a loan, if that sits better with you. Once you're settled at Margaret's place, you can pay it back when you're able. She really does need the help, got more business than she can handle, and a head for numbers like a sieve. You'd be doing her a favor." "Why should I believe you?" Eleanor asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. "How do I know this isn't another trap, another lie?" James McAllister reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a worn photograph. He held it out to Eleanor, who took it with trembling fingers. The image showed a woman with kind eyes and a determined chin, standing in front of a neat two-story building with Mrs. Margaret Brennan's boarding house painted on a sign above the door. "That's Margaret," he said. "Stubborn as a mule and twice as ornery, but she's got a heart bigger than Montana. She took in a Chinese family last winter when everyone else turned them away, helped them set up a laundry business. She believes in giving folks a chance." He paused, then added quietly, "Sometimes people just need one person to believe they're worth saving." Eleanor traced the edge of the photograph with her finger. The woman in the picture looked real, solid, trustworthy, in a way Thomas's flowery letters had never been. "Your journey doesn't have to end in disappointment," James said, his voice gentle but firm. "Sometimes fate has other destinations in mind than the ones we plan for ourselves." A tear escaped before Eleanor could stop it, rolling down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, embarrassed by this show of weakness in front of a stranger. "If this is a deception," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'll have nothing left. Not even hope." "Ma'am," James said, putting his hat back on, "I've got no pretty words to offer like whoever wrote those letters that brought you here. All I can give you is plain truth. My sister needs help, you need work and safety, and that train ticket will get you to both." He touched the brim of his hat. "I'll send a telegram ahead. Let Margaret know to expect you. She'll be at the station." He turned to leave, then paused. "What name should I give her?" "Eleanor," she said, making a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. "Eleanor Parker." "Miss Parker," he said with a nod. "You've got courage coming all this way on faith alone. That kind of courage deserves better than abandonment on a depot platform. I hope you'll take the chance." He walked back to his horse, mounted with an easy grace, and rode toward town without looking back. Eleanor sat staring at the 4 silver dollars, weighing them in her palm. They were heavy, real in a way Thomas's promises had never been. The depot was growing darker, shadows lengthening across the platform. Soon Hollis would close the station for the night, and she'd be truly alone. Eleanor could see shapes moving in the darkness beyond the depot, men from the saloons beginning their nightly revelries. How long before one of them noticed a woman alone? How long before desperation drove her to choices that would destroy not just her reputation but her soul? She thought of the photograph, of Margaret Brennan's steady gaze. A woman who took in strangers, who helped Chinese families when no one else would. It could be another trap, another disappointment. But what choice did she have? Eleanor picked up the silver dollars and walked to the ticket window where Hollis was tallying his daily receipts. "Mr. Hollis," she said, her voice stronger than it had been all day, "I'd like to purchase a ticket to Willow Springs on the evening train." His face brightened with relief. "Oh, thank the Lord, Miss Parker. I've been worrying myself sick about you. McAllister's a good man. If he says his sister will help you, then she will. The McAllisters, they're quality folks." As Hollis prepared her ticket, Eleanor asked, "You know them well?" "Known James McAllister near 10 years, Hollis said, counting out her change. "He runs cattle up near Sweetwater Ranch, about 15 miles from here. Lost his wife to fever 3 winters back. Terrible sad that was. Since then, he's been looking after his sister something fierce. Rides to Willow Springs every month to check on her, make sure she's not working herself to death." He handed Eleanor her ticket. "You can trust him, Miss Parker. In all my years here, I've never known him to break his word." Eleanor held the ticket like a lifeline, this small piece of paper that represented a future, uncertain though it might be. The evening train's whistle sounded in the distance, and she gathered her courage along with her trunk. "Miss Parker," Hollis called as she moved toward the platform edge where passengers would board. "I'm real sorry about what happened with that Whitmore fellow. You deserved better." She managed a small smile. "Thank you, Mr. Hollis. Perhaps I'll find better in Willow Springs." The train arrived in a cloud of steam and smoke, its lamplight cutting through the gathering darkness. The conductor helped Eleanor with her trunk, and she found a seat by the window in the ladies' car. As the train pulled away from Silver Creek, she pressed her face to the glass, watching the depot fade into darkness. She thought she saw a lone rider on a bay horse watching from a distant rise, but it might have been her imagination. Eleanor settled back in her seat, closing her eyes against the tears that threatened to fall. Thomas Whitmore had promised her love, security, a home of her own. He'd painted pictures with his words of sunset dinners and peaceful mornings, of a life filled with purpose and belonging. All lies. But James McAllister had offered her something different. Not promises of love or happiness, but simply a chance. A chance to work, to earn her keep, to rebuild her life from the ashes of her destroyed dreams. It wasn't what she'd come west for, but perhaps it was what she needed. The train rocked gently as it picked up speed, carrying her away from one ending toward what she hoped would be a beginning. Eleanor pulled her mother's handkerchief from her reticule, breathing in the faint scent of lavender that still clung to it. "Give me strength, Mama," she whispered to the darkness outside the window. "I'm so far from home, and I don't know if I'm making another terrible mistake." The conductor came through, lighting the lamps in the car. A few other passengers were scattered throughout. A mother with 2 sleeping children, an elderly man reading a newspaper, a young couple whispering together. Normal people living normal lives, unlike Eleanor, whose entire existence had been upended in the space of an afternoon. She unfolded the telegram one more time, reading the station master's words. No record of Thomas Whitmore. No Whitmore Ranch in vicinity. Suspect fraudulent correspondence. Fraudulent correspondence. Such clinical words for such devastating betrayal. Eleanor wondered if Thomas Whitmore was even his real name. Had anything in his letters been true? The stories about his childhood in Virginia, his time fighting in the war, his dreams of building a cattle empire in Montana, all fabrications designed to lure her into what? What had been his plan when she arrived? To abandon her immediately, or had something spooked him? It didn't matter now. What mattered was surviving, rebuilding, finding a way forward that didn't involve returning to Boston in shame. Uncle Clarence would never let her forget this failure, would use it as evidence that women were too emotional, too trusting to make their own decisions. She'd rather scrub floors in Montana than give him that satisfaction. The train climbed steadily into the mountains, the engine laboring against the grade. Eleanor watched the landscape change from prairie to pine forest, the trees pressing close to the tracks like watchful sentinels. Somewhere out there, wolves hunted and bears roamed. The wilderness was beautiful but unforgiving, much like the frontier itself. A few hours into the journey, the conductor announced a brief stop for water and coal. Eleanor stepped onto the platform to stretch her legs, breathing in the sharp mountain air. The station here was even smaller than Silver Creek's, just a water tower and coal depot with a tiny office. "Miss Parker?" Eleanor turned to find a woman approaching, tall and angular, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. For a moment, Eleanor's heart sank, thinking this might be Margaret Brennan and finding her appearance forbidding. "I'm Mrs. Hartley," the woman said. "I run the Harvey House restaurant here. Hollis from Silver Creek telegraphed ahead, said you might need a decent meal, said it was paid for already." Eleanor's throat tightened. Even in his worry, the station master had thought of her comfort. "That's very kind, but I couldn't—" "Nonsense," Mrs. Hartley interrupted. "You look dead on your feet, girl, and the food's already prepared. Come on, we've only got 15 minutes. She led Eleanor to a small dining room where a plate of beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie waited. The food was simple but good, and Eleanor ate every bite, not realizing how hungry she'd been until the first spoonful hit her stomach. "Heading to Margaret Brennan's place, I hear," Mrs. Hartley said, pouring coffee from a large pot. "Good woman, Margaret, tough but fair. You'll do well there if you're willing to work hard." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Eleanor said, meaning it. Whatever awaited her in Willow Springs, it had to be better than the alternatives. The train whistle called passengers back, and Eleanor thanked Mrs. Hartley before returning to her seat. The meal had revived her somewhat, giving her strength to face whatever came next. Outside, full darkness had fallen, and the window reflected her own face back at her, pale, drawn, but determined. She thought about James McAllister, the quiet cowboy who'd appeared like something out of a dime novel to rescue her. But this wasn't a romantic story where the hero swept the heroine off to happiness. He'd simply offered her a practical solution to a desperate situation. She wondered if she'd ever see him again, this man who'd given her $4 silver and quite possibly saved her life. The photograph of Margaret Brennan was still in her pocket. and Eleanor pulled it out to study it again by lamplight. The boarding house looked respectable, well-maintained. The woman's face was strong rather than pretty, but there was something reassuring about her direct gaze. This was a woman who'd survived the frontier, who'd built something solid in a place where most things were temporary. As the train began its descent toward Willow Springs, Eleanor made herself a promise. She would work harder than she'd ever worked before. She would prove herself worthy of this second chance, would repay James McAllister's kindness not just with money, but by becoming someone who helped others as she'd been helped. She would not let Thomas Whitmore's betrayal define her or destroy her. The lights of Willow Springs appeared in the distance, scattered like fallen stars across the valley floor. The town was larger than Silver Creek, more established. Eleanor could see proper streets laid out in a grid, the spire of a church, what looked like a school. This was a place trying to be civilized, trying to grow beyond its rough origins. The train slowed, brakes squealing against the rails. Eleanor gathered her things, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. What if Margaret Brennan wasn't there? What if this was all another deception? What if she couldn't do the work required? What if? What if? What if? The doubts circled like vultures. But then the train stopped, and through the window, Eleanor saw her. The woman from the photograph standing on the platform with a lantern in her hand, scanning the windows of the cars. When their eyes met, Margaret Brennan smiled, and it transformed her stern face into something warm and welcoming. Eleanor stepped off the train on shaking legs, her trunk handed down by the conductor. Margaret approached with brisk efficiency, her handshake firm and calloused. "Eleanor Parker?" she asked, though it wasn't really a question. "I'm Margaret Brennan. My brother telegraphed that you'd be coming. Said you've had a rough time of it, but that you're educated and looking for honest work." "Yes, ma'am," Eleanor said, finding her voice. "I'm grateful for the opportunity." "None of that, ma'am, business," Margaret interrupted, though not unkindly. "Call me Margaret. We don't stand on ceremony here. Can you really keep books? My ledgers are a disaster, and the tax assessor is coming next month." "I can," Eleanor said with growing confidence. "I managed my uncle's household accounts for 3 years." "Good. Can you read and write well enough to teach?" "I was a governess in Boston before I came west." Margaret's expression softened slightly. "James didn't give me details, just said you'd been deceived by someone and needed a fresh start. We've all got our stories out here, and yours is yours to tell or keep as you choose. What matters is what you do going forward." She picked up one end of Eleanor's trunk without ceremony. "Come on then, the boarding house is just up the street. You look about ready to drop, and we've got a full day ahead tomorrow. The room's small but clean, and you'll take your meals with the rest of us. Sunday's the only day of rest, and even then, there's usually something needs doing." As they walked through the streets of Willow Springs, Eleanor noticed the differences from Silver Creek immediately. The buildings here were more permanent, made of brick and proper lumber rather than rough timber. There were sidewalks along the main street, and the shops had painted signs and glass windows. Women walked freely, though still accompanied, and there seemed to be an actual sense of community rather than just a collection of individuals trying to strike it rich. "We've got a good town here," Margaret said, noticing Eleanor's observation. "The mine's stable, silver, not gold, so we don't get as many fortune seekers. Families are settling, putting down roots. We've got a school, 2 churches, and we're getting a library next year if Mrs. Patterson has her way, and she usually does." The boarding house was exactly as it had appeared in the photograph, 2 stories, painted white with green shutters, a sign hanging from the porch that swayed gently in the night breeze. Light spilled from the windows, warm and inviting. "Most of my boarders are long-term," Margaret explained as they climbed the porch steps. "Mr. Chen and his son run the laundry I mentioned. They have the 2 rooms at the back. Mrs. Rodriguez is our cook. Wait until you taste her tamales. Then there's Frederick Hoffman. He's the bank clerk, quiet as a mouse but reliable with his rent. And Timothy O'Brien works at the mine, sends most of his wages home to Ireland but always pays on time." The interior was clean and well organized, with a parlor to the right, dining room to the left, and stairs straight ahead. Everything was simple but quality, no fancy Eastern furnishings, but solid frontier practicality. "Your room's upstairs," Margaret said, leading the way. "It's the smallest, I won't lie, But it's got a window that faces the mountains, and the stovepipe runs through the wall so it stays warm in winter. The room was indeed small, barely large enough for the narrow bed, washstand, and small wardrobe it contained. But it was clean, with fresh linens on the bed and a rag rug on the floor. After the terror of potentially spending the night on the depot platform, it looked like paradise. "Thank you," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion she couldn't quite suppress. "This is more than adequate." Margaret set down the trunk and studied Eleanor with shrewd eyes. "You're not what I expected when James telegraphed. Most women who come out here chasing marriage promises are different. Harder or softer, if that makes sense. You're educated, refined. What made you trust a stranger's letters?" Eleanor sank onto the bed, suddenly exhausted. "Loneliness, I suppose. And hope. My parents died when I was 17, leaving me with debts, and an uncle who resented having to take me in. I worked as a governess, but it's such a small life, Miss Brennan. Margaret. Always in someone else's home, caring for someone else's children, with no future beyond more of the same. When his letters came, they offered something different, a chance to build something of my own." Margaret's expression softened. "I understand that better than you might think. Why do you think I came out here myself? At least you were brave enough to chase a dream, even if it turned out to be smoke. That takes courage." She moved toward the door. "Breakfast is at 6 sharp. We serve the boarders first, then you'll help Mrs. Rodriguez clean up while I show you the books. In the afternoon, Mrs. Patterson wants to meet you about possibly teaching at the school. We're short a teacher since Miss Collins ran off with that traveling salesman last month." She paused at the threshold. "Eleanor, my brother doesn't often involve himself in other people's troubles. The fact that he helped you means he saw something worth saving. Don't prove him wrong." After Margaret left, Eleanor sat in the quiet of her small room, trying to process everything that had happened. This morning, had it only been this morning? She'd awakened in a hotel in Silver Creek, full of anticipation for meeting Thomas. Now Thomas was revealed as a phantom, and she was starting a new life she'd never imagined. She opened her trunk, hanging her few dresses in the wardrobe. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, was her wedding dress. She'd sewn it herself over months of evenings, each stitch a hope for the future. White silk with pearl buttons, modest but beautiful. Eleanor lifted it out, holding it up to the lamplight. What use did she have for such a dress now? A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting Margaret. Instead, a young Mexican woman entered with a tray. "I am Rosa Rodriguez," she said with a slight accent. "Margaret said you had no dinner, so I brought soup and bread." The kindness of it nearly broke Eleanor's composure. "Thank you, that's very thoughtful." Rosa set the tray on the washstand and noticed the wedding dress. "Ay, qué hermoso," she said softly. "You're getting married." "No," Eleanor said, folding the dress carefully. "Not anymore." Rosa's dark eyes filled with understanding. "The heart, it heals," she said simply. "When my husband died in a mine collapse, I thought I would die too. But here I am, cooking for gringos in Montana." She smiled, softening the words. "Life. It takes us strange places, no? But sometimes strange places become home." After Rosa left, Eleanor ate the soup, a rich chicken broth with vegetables and spices she couldn't identify, but that warmed her from the inside out. She prepared for bed, washing her face with water from the pitcher, changing into her nightgown. The bed was narrow but comfortable, the sheets smelling of sunshine and sage. As she lay in the darkness, Eleanor thought about James McAllister, somewhere out there in the night. She wondered what had made him stop to help her, what he'd seen in her desperation that made him think she was worth saving. Margaret had said he'd lost his wife. Perhaps he understood something about loss and the need for second chances. Through her window, she could see stars, more than she'd ever seen in Boston, where gas lamps and smoke obscured the sky. The vastness of it all made her feel small, but also oddly comforted. Under these same stars, thousands of women had made new lives in the West, had survived betrayals and losses, and emerged stronger. She could too. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. She'd have to prove herself capable, worthy of the trust these strangers had placed in her. She'd have to learn to navigate this frontier town with its different rules and expectations. She'd have to rebuild not just her life, but her very sense of self, discovering who Eleanor Parker was when stripped of everything she'd thought defined her. But tonight, for the first time since reading that devastating telegram, she had a bed to sleep in, a roof over her head, and the possibility of a future, even if it wasn't the one she'd imagined. James McAllister's words echoed in her mind. Your journey doesn't have to end in disappointment. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps this wasn't an ending at all, but a beginning she simply hadn't expected. As sleep finally claimed her, Eleanor's last thought was of sage honey eyes and a voice that had offered hope when she'd had none left. She'd probably never see James McAllister again, but she'd carry his kindness with her, a reminder that even in the harshest places, good people existed. The sound of a guitar drifted up from somewhere below, probably Mr. O'Brien entertaining the other boarders. It was a melancholy tune, something Irish and old, speaking of loves lost and homes left behind. But underneath the sadness was something else. Resilience, determination, the stubborn refusal to let sorrow have the last word. Eleanor pulled the quilts up to her chin and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would come soon enough with its demands and challenges. But for now, she was safe, she was sheltered, and she was no longer alone. In a frontier town 2,000 miles from everything she'd known, Eleanor Parker began the slow process of rebuilding herself from the ashes of her abandoned dreams. The depot at Silver Creek seemed like something from another lifetime already, that platform where she'd stood paralyzed by despair. The woman who'd stood there, trusting, naive, destroyed by betrayal, was already changing, hardening in some ways, softening in others. The frontier demanded transformation, and Eleanor, whether she knew it or not, was already answering that demand. The rooster's crow pierced through Eleanor's dreams, pulling her from sleep into the gray dawn light filtering through her window. For a moment, she forgot where she was, reaching instinctively for the familiar surroundings of her Boston bedroom. Then reality crashed back. The small room, the narrow bed, the events of yesterday that had left her in this frontier boarding house, with nothing but the kindness of strangers keeping her from complete ruin. She dressed quickly in her simplest day dress, a brown wool that had seen better days but was appropriate for work. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pinned up her hair, remembering how she'd styled it yesterday morning with such care, wanting to look perfect for Thomas. The woman in the mirror looked older somehow, though only a day had passed. Her blue eyes, which Uncle Clarence had always said were too dreamy for her own good, now held something harder, more cautious. The boarding house was already alive with activity when Eleanor descended the stairs. She could hear voices from the kitchen, the clatter of pans, and smell coffee brewing strong enough to wake the dead. The dining room held a long table set for 8, with mismatched chairs that somehow looked right together, each one sturdy and functional. "There you are," Margaret said, emerging from the kitchen with a coffee pot. She looked as if she'd been awake for hours already, her gray hair perfectly pinned, her apron crisp despite the flour dusting one corner. "Right on time. Good. I can't abide laziness." The other boarders were already gathering. Mr. Chen and his son, both dressed in clean but worn clothing, nodded politely to Eleanor. Frederick Hoffman, thin and nervous-looking with wire spectacles that reminded her of the station master in Silver Creek, offered a shy smile. Timothy O'Brien, a large man with bright red hair and arms like tree trunks from his work in the mines, stood when she entered. "You'll be the new lass Margaret mentioned," he said in a thick Irish brogue. "Timothy O'Brien, at your service. Welcome to our motley crew." "Eleanor Parker," she replied, grateful for the warmth in his voice. "Thank you for the music last night. It was lovely." "Ah, you heard that, did you? I hope I didn't keep you awake." "Not at all. It was comforting." Rosa emerged from the kitchen carrying platters of eggs, bacon, and biscuits that made Eleanor's mouth water despite her nervousness. The meal was simple but abundant, everyone eating with the focused attention of people who worked hard for their living. "Miss Parker's going to be helping with the books," Margaret announced to the table, "and possibly teaching at the school, if Mrs. Patterson approves." "Thank the saints for that," O'Brien said. "My nephew's been running wild since Miss Collins left. Boy needs schooling before he turns completely feral." "Your nephew needs a firm hand is what he needs," Margaret said tartly. I caught him putting frogs in Mrs. Henderson's water barrel last week." "Boys will be boys," O'Brien said with a grin that suggested he'd done similar things in his youth. After breakfast, Eleanor helped Rosa clear the table, learning the rhythm of the kitchen work. Rosa moved with practiced efficiency, washing while Eleanor dried, and they worked in companionable silence until Rosa suddenly asked, "The man who lied to you, he had a handsome face in his letters?" Eleanor almost smiled at the phrasing. "He had handsome words. I never saw his face." "Sometimes that is worse," Rosa said thoughtfully. "The imagination, it makes princes from paupers. My husband, when I first saw him, I thought he was too short. But his heart, his heart was tall like a mountain." Margaret appeared in the doorway. "When you're done here, Eleanor, I need you in the study. The books won't sort themselves, and Lord knows I've made a mess of them." The study was a small room behind the stairs, cramped with papers and ledgers that looked as if they'd been organized by someone throwing them in the air and letting them fall where they might. Margaret stood amid the chaos, hands on her hips, looking both defiant and embarrassed. "I can run a boarding house," she said. "I can cook for 20, manage difficult boarders, repair a roof if I have to. But numbers are my enemy." Eleanor picked up one of the ledgers, opening it to find entries in at least 3 different hands, some in pencil, some in ink, dates out of order, and calculations that didn't match. "How long since these were properly kept?" she asked, trying not to sound horrified. 6 months, maybe 7. I had a man who helped, but he took off for the goldfields in the Black Hills. Margaret sighed. "I've been trying to keep up, but between the cooking, the cleaning, the marketing, I'll need time to sort through everything," Eleanor said, her mind already beginning to organize the task. "Several days at least to understand the system, then I can create something more manageable." "You can actually make sense of this mess?" "My uncle was a merchant," Eleanor explained. "His books were complex, multiple suppliers, credit accounts, seasonal variations. This is actually less complicated, just disorganized." Margaret's relief was palpable. "Thank God James found you. I've been dreading the tax assessor's visit like it was the second coming." She left Eleanor to begin sorting through the papers, and for the first time since arriving in Montana, Eleanor felt genuinely useful. This was something she could do, something that required her skills rather than just her desperation. She organized the receipts by date, separated income from expenses, began creating a system that would make sense not just to her, but to Margaret as well. The morning passed quickly, punctuated only by Rosa bringing her coffee and a slice of pound cake. "For the brain," she said with a wink. "Numbers make me hungry just looking at them." Around noon, Margaret reappeared. "Mrs. Patterson is here to meet you about the teaching position. Try not to let her intimidate you. She's got opinions about everything and isn't shy about sharing them." Mrs. Patterson turned out to be a formidable woman in her 60s, with silver hair arranged in an elaborate style that belonged more in a Boston parlor than a frontier town. Her dress was purple silk, impractical but impressive, and she carried herself like a queen granting an audience. "So you're the young woman from Boston," she said, examining Eleanor through a lorgnette that seemed entirely for show. "Margaret says you're educated." "Where?" "Miss Penelope's Academy for Young Ladies," Eleanor replied. "Then 3 years as a governess for the Hartwell family on Beacon Hill." "The shipping Hartwells?" "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Patterson's demeanor thawed slightly. "I knew Catherine Hartwell when we were girls. How is she?" "She passed away 2 years ago. Consumption." "Ah." Mrs. Patterson's face softened with genuine sadness. "We corresponded until the end. She mentioned a governess she was fond of, very accomplished," she said. "That would have been you?" "I taught her 3 daughters, French, piano, literature, and arithmetic." "Can you handle boys? They're different creatures entirely out here. Wild as mustangs and twice as stubborn." Eleanor thought of the chaos she'd sometimes faced with the Hartwell girls, who despite their refined upbringing could be plenty wild themselves. Children are children, Mrs. Patterson. They all need structure, encouragement, and the knowledge that someone believes they can learn. Mrs. Patterson studied her for a long moment. "The position pays $20 a month. You'll teach all grades. We have 18 students currently, ages 6 to 15. Can you handle that range?" "Yes, ma'am." School runs Monday through Friday, 8 to 3, with an hour for lunch. You'll need to arrive early to start the stove in winter. You'll also be expected to organize the Christmas pageant and the spring recitation. She paused. Can you start Monday? Eleanor's heart leaped. Teaching and bookkeeping combined would give her enough income to repay James McAllister and begin saving for whatever future she could build. Yes, Mrs. Patterson, I'd be honored. Don't be honored yet, the older woman said dryly. Wait until you meet the O'Brien boy. Terror incarnate, that one. His uncle tries, but the boy needs a woman's influence. She stood, smoothing her skirts. I'll have the schoolhouse ready for you. And Miss Parker? Don't let me hear you've run off with some smooth-talking man like the last teacher. This town needs stability. After she left, Margaret chuckled. That went better than expected. She didn't even ask about your circumstances in coming here. She knew the family I worked for. That seemed to be enough. Connections matter, even out here, Margaret agreed. Sometimes especially out here. Now, back to those books. If you can make sense of them before the assessor arrives, I'll throw in an extra $1 a week to your wages. The afternoon dissolved into numbers and calculations, Eleanor's mind finding peace in the orderly progression of mathematics. There was something soothing about problems that had definitive solutions, unlike the messy emotional chaos of the past day. She was so absorbed that she didn't notice the light changing until Rosa called her for supper. The evening meal was livelier than breakfast, with O'Brien regaling the table with stories from the mine and Mr. Hoffman quietly discussing interest rates with Mr. Chen, who was apparently quite successful with his laundry business and looking to expand. Eleanor found herself relaxing into the conversation, these people already beginning to feel less like strangers. After supper, she returned to the books while the others gathered in the parlor. Through the open door, she could hear O'Brien's guitar again, Rosa singing along in Spanish to a melody that transcended language barriers. It was a warm sound, a family sound, though none of them were actually related. You're still working? Eleanor looked up to find Margaret in the doorway with 2 cups of tea. I wanted to finish reconciling March before I stopped, Eleanor said, accepting the cup gratefully. Margaret sat in the other chair, looking tired for the first time. You remind me of myself when I first came here, determined to prove I was worth something, that I could make it on my own. Your brother mentioned you came as a mail-order bride. Did he? Margaret's expression was unreadable. That's true enough. Robert Brennan was a good man, older than me by 15 years but kind. We had 3 years together before pneumonia took him, left me this house and enough money to turn it into a boarding business. She sipped her tea. It wasn't the life I'd imagined, but it became the life I needed. Do you ever regret coming west? Every woman who comes west has regrets, Margaret said honestly. We leave family, familiarity, safety. We trade those things for possibility. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. The trick is making something from whatever hand you're dealt. Your brother seems to have done well for himself. Margaret's expression shifted, something knowing in her eyes. James is a good man. Too good sometimes. He blames himself for things beyond his control. She stood. Speaking of which, he'll be coming to town on Saturday for supplies. He usually takes Sunday dinner here. You'll likely see him then. Eleanor felt an unexpected flutter in her stomach at the thought. I should thank him properly for his help. Just don't let him brush it off as nothing, Margaret advised. He needs to know his kindness matters, that it makes a difference. He's been too long in his own grief, convincing himself he has nothing left to offer anyone. Later, in her small room, Eleanor wrote a letter to Uncle Clarence, not asking for help or admitting defeat, but simply informing him she'd secured respectable employment in Montana and would write again when settled. She sealed it before she could second-guess herself, knowing he'd read between the lines, understand that Thomas Whitmore had been a fiction. Let him have his satisfaction. She was beyond caring about his opinion now. The next days fell into a rhythm. Mornings helping Rosa, then hours with the ledgers, watching order emerge from chaos. She visited the schoolhouse with Mrs. Patterson, finding it better equipped than expected with McGuffey readers, a globe, and even a small collection of books for a lending library. The students she'd meet on Monday were a mix of backgrounds, miners' children, merchants' offspring, Even two Chinese children whose presence caused some grumbling that Mrs. Patterson silenced with a look that could freeze fire. Friday evening brought unexpected excitement when O'Brien burst through the door with news. There's been a strike at the northern shaft. Not gold, mind you, but silver rich enough to make everyone's shares worth something. The boarding house erupted in celebration, Rosa bringing out a bottle of wine she'd been saving, everyone toasting to good fortune. Eleanor found herself caught up in the joy, these people's happiness becoming her own. When O'Brien grabbed her hands and spun her in an impromptu dance while singing an Irish blessing, she laughed freely for the first time since leaving Boston. "Your good luck, Miss Eleanor," he declared. "Everything's been looking up since you arrived." "That's the wine talking," Eleanor protested, but she was smiling. "No, it's true," Mr. Chen said in his quiet way. "Good people bring good fortune. The universe seeks balance." Saturday morning brought a nervous energy Eleanor couldn't quite explain. She found herself taking extra care with her appearance, telling herself it was because she'd be working at the front desk, helping Margaret with arriving guests. It had nothing to do with James McAllister's expected arrival. She was entering figures in the new ledger she'd created when the bell above the door chimed. Looking up, she found those sage honey eyes she'd remembered all week. James McAllister stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking wind-worn and dusty from the ride, but somehow more solid and real than anything else in the room. "Miss Parker," he said with a slight nod. "You're looking well. The position suits you?" "Very well, Mr. McAllister," she managed, her voice steadier than her pulse. "Thanks to your kindness." "No thanks needed. Margaret needed help, you needed work. Simple as that." But it wasn't simple, and they both knew it. He could have ridden past that depot platform, could have left her to whatever fate awaited. The fact that he'd stopped, that he'd cared enough to help a stranger, was anything but simple in a world where most people looked out only for themselves. "James, stop looming in the doorway," Margaret called from the kitchen. "Come in properly and wash up. Rosa's making your favorite, chile verde." He moved into the room with that easy grace Eleanor remembered, but she noticed now the slight favor of his left leg, probably an old injury. There was gray at his temples she hadn't seen in the depot's harsh light, and lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter as well as sorrow. "You've done wonders with Margaret's books," he observed, looking at the neat columns of figures. "She's been fretting about them for months." "It was just a matter of creating a system," Eleanor said. "Your sister is excellent at running the business. She just needed a method for tracking it." "Don't let her modesty fool you," Margaret said, emerging with coffee. "She's got the finest hand for numbers I've ever seen, and Mrs. Patterson's already sung her praises about the school, says the children are actually excited about Monday." "You're teaching too?" James asked, something that might have been approval in his eyes. "Starting Monday. It seems I'm to be kept quite busy." "Good," he said simply. "Busy is good out here. Keeps the mind from wandering to places it shouldn't go." There was understanding in his tone, the recognition of someone who knew about thoughts that circled like wolves in the night. Eleanor wondered what memories kept him company on that ranch, 15 miles from nowhere. The day took on a different quality with James's presence. He fixed a loose board on the porch, helped Mr. Chen move some heavy equipment for his expanding laundry, discussed the silver strike with O'Brien. But Eleanor noticed how his eyes found her throughout the day, quick glances that made her acutely aware of herself in ways she hadn't been since Thomas's letters first arrived. That evening, the boarding house was fuller than usual. Word of the silver strike had brought in travelers wanting to stake claims or invest in existing ones. Eleanor helped serve dinner, the dining room crowded and loud with excited conversation. She was carrying a tray of dishes to the kitchen when she collided with someone in the doorway, plates crashing to the floor in a symphony of destruction. "Oh, I'm so sorry." She dropped to her knees, gathering the broken pieces, mortified by her clumsiness. "No harm done," a familiar voice said, and she looked up to find James kneeling beside her, carefully picking up the larger shards. "Just plates. They break. You buy new ones." "But they're Margaret's good dishes," which she got secondhand from a woman heading back east, he said with a slight smile. "Don't think she'll miss them too much." Their hands brushed as they reached for the same piece, and Eleanor jerked back as if burned. Something flickered in James's eyes, but before either could speak, Rosa appeared with a broom. "Aye, these things happen. Go, go. I clean this." Eleanor fled to the kitchen, her cheeks burning. She was being ridiculous, acting like a schoolgirl around a man who'd simply shown her kindness. She was here to work, to rebuild her life, not to develop foolish feelings for a widowed rancher who probably still mourned his wife. Yet later, when the dishes were done and the kitchen cleaned, she found herself lingering on the back porch where James stood smoking a pipe, looking at the stars. "I never thanked you properly," she said, keeping a respectful distance. "What you did? It saved me from... I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't helped." "You'd have survived," he said quietly. "You're stronger than you think, Miss Parker. Coming all this way on faith alone, then picking yourself up when that faith proved false, that takes courage. Or foolishness. Sometimes they're the same thing." He tapped his pipe against the railing, sending sparks into the darkness. "My wife, Sarah, she came out here with nothing but determination and a dream of something better. Everybody told her she was foolish, marrying a man with nothing but land and ambition. But she built a life anyway, made that ranch into something worth having. Margaret mentioned you lost her. I'm sorry. 3 winters ago. Fever took her in 2 days, barely time to say goodbye." His voice was steady, but Eleanor heard the grief threaded through it. "I've been running that ranch like she's still there, keeping everything the way she arranged it. Foolish, maybe, but it's all I knew how to do." "Grief makes us do strange things," Eleanor said softly. "After my parents died, I kept making my father's coffee every morning for a month, setting it on his desk in the study. Uncle Clarence thought I'd lost my mind." "Maybe we do lose our minds a little," James said. "Maybe that's the only way to survive loss that big. Go a little crazy until we learn how to be sane in a new way." They stood in comfortable silence, the night sounds of the town drifting around them. Piano music from a saloon, dogs barking, the distant whistle of a late train. Eleanor felt something settling in her chest, a calmness she hadn't experienced since those first lying letters had arrived. "I should go in," she finally said. "Tomorrow's Sunday, but there's still breakfast to help with." "Miss Parker," James called as she reached the door. "I'm glad you're doing well here. Margaret needed help, but more than that, I think maybe you needed to be here. Some things are meant to happen, even if they come about in painful ways." Eleanor carried those words up to her room, turning them over like smooth stones in her mind. Was he right? Was there purpose in Thomas's deception, in the journey that had brought her here? It seemed too early to know, but for the first time, she could imagine that her story might have a different ending than the tragedy she'd envisioned on that depot platform. Sunday arrived with church bells that reminded Eleanor of Boston, though the service itself was frontier casual, held in a building that doubled as the town hall. She sat with Margaret and Rosa, very aware of James 2 pews ahead, his broad shoulders and sun-lightened hair drawing her eyes despite her best efforts to focus on Reverend Mill's sermon about finding manna in the wilderness. After church, the boarding house tradition of Sunday dinner brought everyone together around the expanded dining table. James carved the roast while Margaret directed traffic. O'Brien told jokes that made Rosa blush and laugh, and Mr. Hoffman surprised everyone by revealing he played the violin, offering to perform after dessert. "You're full of surprises, Frederick," Margaret said. 4 months you've been here and not a word about music." "One doesn't like to impose," he said shyly. "Impose away," O'Brien boomed. "We could use more culture around here." The afternoon unwound like a spool of golden thread, Hoffman's violin joining O'Brien's guitar, Rosa teaching Eleanor a traditional dance from her village while the men clapped along. Even the usually reserved Mr. Chen smiled, his son attempting the steps with earnest concentration. James didn't dance, but Eleanor caught him watching her, something unguarded in his expression that made her stumble over the next step. When their eyes met, he didn't look away immediately, as he usually did, and the moment stretched between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. As the sun began to sink, James prepared to leave for his ranch. Eleanor was helping clear the dessert plates when he appeared in the kitchen doorway. "I wanted to say goodbye before I left," he said, "and to wish you luck with the school tomorrow." "Thank you. I'm nervous but excited. It's been a while since I taught." "You'll do fine. Children know when someone genuinely cares about them. He hesitated, then added, I come to town most Saturdays for supplies. Perhaps, perhaps next week you'd allow me to show you the countryside. There's a spot up on Miller's Ridge where you can see 3 territories on a clear day. Eleanor's heart skipped. Yes, I'd like that. If Margaret can spare me. Oh, I think she can manage, Margaret said dryly from behind them, making them both jump. In fact, I insist. Eleanor's been working too hard. A little fresh air would do her good. James's smile transformed his weathered face, making him look younger, lighter. Saturday, then, after I finish my business in town. 2 o'clock? 2 o'clock, Eleanor agreed, trying not to sound as breathless as she felt. After he left, Margaret gave her a knowing look. My brother doesn't ask people to ride with him, hasn't done so since Sarah died. You be careful with his heart, Eleanor Parker. We're not. Eleanor fumbled for words. Not yet, Margaret said sagely. But some things are inevitable as sunrise. Just remember, James doesn't do anything halfway. When he commits, it's completely. Make sure you're ready for that before you let this go where it's heading. That night, Eleanor lay awake thinking about unexpected journeys and unplanned destinations. A week ago, she'd been abandoned, desperate, certain her life was over. Now she had work, purpose, even the possibility of something she didn't dare name yet. The woman who'd boarded that train in Boston, full of dreams about Thomas Whitmore, seemed like a stranger now. That woman had been willing to settle for pretty words and promises. This new Eleanor, forged in the crucible of betrayal and survival, wanted something more substantial. She wanted truth over poetry, steadiness over grand gestures, real kindness over manufactured charm. She wanted someone who would stop to help a stranger not for gain but because it was right. Someone with sage honey eyes and work-worn hands, who understood grief and didn't try to pretty it up with platitudes. Monday morning arrived with a test of all Eleanor's newfound strength. The schoolhouse was full of skeptical faces, children who'd run wild for weeks and weren't eager to return to discipline. The O'Brien boy, true to reputation, immediately tried to establish dominance by putting a snake in her desk drawer. Eleanor calmly picked up the snake, a harmless garter snake she recognized from her childhood summers in the country, and carried it to the window. Thank you, Michael, for bringing such an excellent example of local wildlife. We'll be studying reptiles next week, and you've given us a head start. You can write a 2-page essay on the habits of garter snakes, due Wednesday. The boy's face went from triumph to shock to grudging respect in the space of seconds. By lunch, she had them sorted. The eager learners in front, the troublemakers separated, the shy ones coaxed forward with gentle encouragement. When Mrs. Patterson stopped by at dismissal, she found them actually working, heads bent over slates, the room quiet except for the scratch of chalk. Miraculous, the older woman murmured. You might actually last, Miss Parker. The week developed its own rhythm. School until 3, bookkeeping until supper, helping Rosa in the evenings, falling into bed exhausted but satisfied. Each day, Eleanor felt herself growing stronger, more capable, more certain that she could build a life here. Thursday brought an unexpected challenge when a man appeared at the boarding house, asking for her by name. Eleanor's blood ran cold when she saw him, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of smooth handsomeness that reminded her painfully of how she'd imagined Thomas. Miss Parker? My name is Daniel Morrison. I heard there was a new teacher in town come from Boston. I wondered if you might be the same Miss Parker who corresponded with my associate, Thomas Whitmore. Eleanor's hands clenched in her skirts. What do you want? To apologize, actually, and to explain, if you'll let me. Thomas, that wasn't his real name, he's gone. Headed to California, last I heard. But what he did to you, it wasn't supposed to happen that way. What was supposed to happen? Eleanor's voice was ice. Morrison had the grace to look ashamed. He was supposed to marry you, actually, set up a legitimate household, but then he got word that his past was catching up. Debts, angry husbands, the law. He ran rather than face it, left you stranded. I only just learned about it when I came through Silver Creek. And you've come to, what? Absolve your conscience? To make amends, if possible. He pulled out a wallet. The money he took from you, the fare and expenses, I'd like to repay it. Eleanor looked at the bills he offered. Probably $50 or more. Enough to change everything, to give her choices she didn't currently have. But taking it felt like accepting that what had happened to her was a transaction, something that could be balanced with money. No, she said firmly. I don't want your money or your apologies. What's done is done. I've made my own way, and I'll continue to do so without charity from confidence men or their associates. Morrison studied her with something like admiration. You're not what I expected. Thomas said you were sweet, biddable, easy to manipulate. Thomas never knew me at all. He knew a fiction I presented in letters, just as I knew only his lies. Now please leave. I have work to do. He left, but not before saying, You're better off without him, Miss Parker. You've got steel in you. Thomas wouldn't have known what to do with that. Eleanor stood shaking in the doorway until Margaret appeared, drawn by some instinct for trouble. Who was that? A ghost, Eleanor said. One I just put to rest. Margaret squeezed her shoulder. Good. The past has no business interfering with the future. Speaking of which, you might want to get cleaned up. Tomorrow's Friday, which means Saturday's coming, and unless I miss my guess, you'll be thinking about what to wear for that ride with James. Eleanor blushed, but didn't deny it. She was thinking about Saturday, about the promise of open sky and honest company, about the possibility that her journey west might lead somewhere she'd never expected, but exactly where she needed to be. That night, she wrote in the journal she'd started keeping, I came west believing I knew what I wanted. A husband, a home, a family of my own. Thomas Whitmore's betrayal shattered those dreams, but perhaps they needed shattering. They were built on desperation and loneliness, not strength and choice. Now I find myself creating a different life, one where I earn my own way, where respect comes from my abilities, not my connection to a man, where friendship is offered freely without conditions. And if something more develops with James McAllister, this kind, steady man who sees me clearly, it will be because we choose each other, not because we need each other for survival. That seems like a stronger foundation for building a future. Saturday dawned clear and warm, the kind of perfect spring day that made the Montana Territory show off its spectacular beauty. Eleanor had changed dresses 3 times before settling on her blue calico. Pretty, but practical, appropriate for riding. She'd borrowed Rosa's wide-brimmed hat to protect against the sun and tried not to pace as 2 o'clock approached. James arrived promptly, leading a gentle mare alongside his own mount. Her name's Buttercup, he said, with a slightly embarrassed smile. Sarah named her for her golden coat. She's sweet-tempered and sure-footed. Eleanor stroked the mare's nose, feeling the soft warmth of her breath. She's beautiful. Can you ride? I should have asked before. A little. We had horses when I was young before. She trailed off, not wanting to discuss her family's financial collapse. Before life changed things, James finished gently. I understand. Come on, let's get you mounted. Margaret's watching from the window, and if we don't leave soon, she'll find some emergency that needs attending. He helped her mount with careful propriety, his hands steady at her waist just long enough to ensure she was secure. They rode through town at an easy walk, people calling greetings that James returned with nods and Eleanor with smiles. She was part of this community now, recognized, belonging in a way she hadn't belonged anywhere since her parents' deaths. Once past the town limits, the land opened up in waves of grass and wildflowers. James led them along a trail that wound steadily upward, through stands of pine and aspen, across clear streams that chuckled over stones. He rode easily, naturally, like the horse was an extension of himself, occasionally pointing out landmarks or wildlife. There's an eagle's nest in that dead pine, he said, indicating a tall skeleton of a tree. Been there 6 years now. They come back every spring, raise their young, then head south for winter. That consistency, that faithfulness. It's something, isn't it? They climbed steadily for an hour before reaching the ridge. James helped her dismount, and they stood together looking out at a view that stole Eleanor's breath. Mountains stretched in every direction, some still crowned with snow, valleys green between them, and the silver ribbon of a river winding through it all. It's magnificent, Eleanor breathed. Sarah loved it up here, James said quietly. Said it made our troubles seem small, seeing all this space that doesn't care about human problems. He paused, then added, This is the first time I've been here since she died. Couldn't face it alone. But you're not alone now, Eleanor said softly. He turned to look at her, and something shifted in the air between them, a recognition of possibility that hadn't been there before. No, he agreed. I'm not. They spread a blanket Margaret had packed and shared the simple lunch, bread, cheese, early strawberries from Rose's garden. James told her about his ranch, the cattle, his plans to expand into horse breeding. Eleanor told him about her students, the small victories of getting them to love learning, the way the Chen children were teaching the others Chinese words at recess. You're good for this town, James said. Good for the children, good for Margaret. He hesitated, then added quietly, good for me. You've reminded me that life keeps moving forward, whether we're ready or not. You saved me, Eleanor said simply. Not just from that depot platform, but from becoming someone bitter and broken. Your kindness, when you had no reason to offer it, that changed everything. I had reasons, James said, his voice rough. When I saw you there, trying so hard to maintain your dignity despite everything crashing down, I saw Sarah. I saw every woman who's taken a chance on the frontier, who's risked everything for the possibility of something better. I couldn't ride past that. The sun was beginning to sink lower, painting the mountains gold and purple. This moment felt suspended outside of time, precious and fragile. Eleanor, James said, using her given name for the first time, I need you to know, I'm not looking to replace Sarah. What we had was what it was, and it's gone. But maybe there's room for something new, something different but equally real. I'm not the woman who wrote those letters to Thomas anymore, Eleanor said. That woman was desperate, willing to be whatever someone else wanted. I'm finding out who I really am now, and I like her better. She's stronger, more honest, less willing to accept pretty lies. I don't have any pretty lies, James said with a slight smile. Just a ranch that needs work, a sister who will interfere constantly, and a man who's forgotten how to court a woman properly. But I can offer truth, respect, and time to let things develop naturally. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, not of sadness, but of recognition. This was what real possibility looked like. Not grand promises and poetry, but honest words and patient intention. I'd like that, she said. The time, the truth, all of it. James reached over and took her hand, his fingers calloused and warm around hers. They sat in silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. Two people who'd been broken by life finding in each other the possibility of wholeness. The ride back was quiet but companionable, their horses walking close enough that occasionally Eleanor's skirt brushed James's leg. The town was lighting lamps as they arrived, windows glowing warm in the gathering dusk. At the boarding house, James helped her dismount, his hands lingering just a moment at her waist. Next Saturday? He asked. Yes, Eleanor said simply. Margaret was waiting in the parlor, trying unsuccessfully to look like she hadn't been watching for them. Good ride? She asked with studied casualness. Perfect, Eleanor said, and meant it. That night, as Eleanor helped with supper, Rosa hummed a love song in Spanish, giving her knowing looks. O'Brien winked when he passed her in the hall, and even Mr. Hoffman smiled more than usual. The whole household seemed to sense that something had shifted, that possibility had taken root. You look happy, Mr. Chen observed quietly as Eleanor served him tea. Real happiness, not the kind people pretend. It suits you. Eleanor thought about that as she prepared for bed. Happiness. Such a simple word for such a complex feeling. She'd thought she'd been happy when Thomas's letters arrived, but that had been desperate relief dressed up as joy. This was different, calmer, deeper, more sustainable. This was happiness built on solid ground rather than wishes. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm as natural as breathing, each Saturday bringing James to town with supplies to sell and business to conduct. Each Saturday, ending with their rides into the surrounding countryside. They explored hidden valleys where wildflowers grew thick as carpet, followed deer trails through stands of ancient pine, sat by streams talking about everything and nothing while their horses grazed nearby. Eleanor discovered that James had a dry humor that emerged slowly, like sun breaking through clouds. He'd make observations about his cattle that had her laughing until her sides hurt, or deliver perfectly timed comments about the town gossips that revealed he noticed far more than his quiet demeanor suggested. In turn, she shared stories of Boston society that seemed absurd now. The elaborate rules and restrictions that had governed her life before Montana's freedom had shown her a different way to exist. "You really had to change gloves 6 times a day?" James asked one afternoon as they sat by Miller's Creek, their feet dangling in the cold water. "Different occasions require different gloves," Eleanor explained, smiling at the memory. "Morning gloves for household tasks, calling gloves for visits, dinner gloves for evening, and heaven forbid you wear the wrong ones. Mrs. Hartwell once sent her daughter back upstairs 3 times for wearing ivory instead of cream. And now?" James gestured at her bare hands, sun-browned from work and teaching. "Now I have freedom," Eleanor said simply. "My hands can be useful instead of just ornamental." It was during their 4th Saturday ride that the weather turned violent without warning. They'd ridden farther than usual, exploring a box canyon James wanted to show her where ancient drawings decorated the rock walls. The sky had been clear when they'd entered the canyon, but as they emerged, black clouds were rolling in from the north like an advancing army. "Storm coming fast," James said, his expression tightening with concern. "We need shelter now." Lightning split the sky, followed immediately by thunder that made the horses dance nervously. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in moments, and the first fat raindrops began to fall. "There's a line shack about a mile east," James shouted over the rising wind. "Can you ride hard?" Eleanor nodded, gathering her reins. They pushed the horses into a gallop, racing the storm across the grassland. The rain hit in earnest when they were still half a mile out, soaking them instantly, turning the trail to mud. Eleanor's hat blew off, her hair whipping loose from its pins, but she bent low over Buttercup's neck and held on. The line shack appeared through the gray curtain of rain, a small log structure used by cowboys during roundups. James practically pulled Eleanor from her saddle, pushing her toward the door while he fought to secure the horses in the lean-to shelter attached to the shack's side. She stumbled inside, gasping, water streaming from her clothes. The shack was basic but clean, a single room with a potbelly stove, a narrow bunk, a table and 2 chairs, shelves with emergency supplies. Eleanor's hands shook as she tried to light the lamp, everything made difficult by her soaked clothes and the cold that had seized her muscles. James burst through the door, fighting to close it against the wind. He was soaked through, his shirt plastered to his chest, water running from his hair into his eyes. "You all right?" he asked immediately, crossing to where she stood shivering. Just cold," Eleanor managed through chattering teeth. James moved with swift efficiency, finding matches and kindling, getting a fire started in the stove. "There should be blankets in that chest," he said, indicating a wooden box near the bunk. "Get out of those wet clothes before you catch pneumonia." Eleanor hesitated, acutely aware they were alone together, miles from town, in circumstances that would destroy her reputation if anyone knew. "Eleanor," James said firmly, his back to her as he fed wood to the growing fire. "This is about survival, not propriety. I'll keep my back turned, but you need to get warm and dry now." The authority in his voice broke through her paralysis. She found 2 rough wool blankets in the chest, and behind the partial privacy of the open chest lid, she peeled off her soaked dress and petticoats, wrapping herself tightly in one blanket before draping the other around her shoulders. Her wet clothes she hung on pegs near the stove, trying not to think about how intimate this simple domestic act was. "You can turn around," she said quietly. James did, and she saw he'd removed his wet shirt, though he'd kept his trousers despite their soaked state. His chest was lean and strong from years of physical work, a few scars marking his skin with stories she didn't know. He moved to hang his shirt beside her dress, the domesticity of their garments side by side making Eleanor's breath catch. "The storm will pass," he said, though he seemed to be saying something else entirely. "These summer storms, they're violent but brief." Thunder shook the small shack, lightning illuminating everything in stark relief. Eleanor pulled the blankets tighter, moving closer to the stove's warmth. James added more wood, then sat in one of the chairs, maintaining careful distance between them. "I should apologize," he said quietly. "I shouldn't have taken you so far from town. If anyone finds out, They won't, Eleanor interrupted. And you couldn't have predicted this storm. Besides, she added with a slight smile, my reputation was already compromised the moment I arrived in Silver Creek as a jilted mail-order bride. This can hardly make things worse. You're not ruined, James said fiercely. You're the most respectable woman in Willow Springs. You teach their children, keep Margaret's books, help at church. Anyone who says otherwise will answer to me. The protectiveness in his voice warmed Eleanor more than the stove. You can't fight the whole town for my honor, James. Watch me, he said simply, and she believed he would. They sat in companionable silence, listening to the storm rage outside. The shack was warming now, the windows fogging with condensation. Eleanor felt hyper-aware of everything, the scratch of wool against her bare skin, the way firelight played across James's face and chest, the intimacy of being alone together while the world disappeared behind sheets of rain. Tell me about Sarah, she said suddenly, needing to break the tension with something real. Not the loss of her, but who she was. James's expression softened. She was tiny, barely came to my shoulder, but she had the biggest personality in any room, stubborn as a mule about things she believed in. She's the one who insisted we needed to build the ranch near water even though it meant harder work clearing the land. She was right, of course. That water's kept us going through 2 droughts. How did you meet? At a church social in Denver? I was there buying cattle, covered in trail dust, completely out of place. She marched right up to me and said I looked like I needed a decent meal and possibly a lecture about proper hygiene. He smiled at the memory. She provided both. We were married 3 months later. That's fast, Eleanor observed. When you know, James said simply. Sarah used to say that life was too short and too uncertain to waste time pretending we didn't love each other. Eleanor thought about Thomas's letters, how she'd convinced herself she loved him based on nothing but pretty words. How do you know, though? How do you tell the difference between real feeling and wishful thinking? James considered this, his eyes thoughtful. Sarah said real love makes you more yourself, not less. It doesn't ask you to shrink or pretend or perform. It sees who you are, complete with flaws and fears, and says, yes, this one. Thomas wanted me to be a character from a story, Eleanor said quietly. The devoted bride, the grateful woman, the ornament for his imaginary ranch. He never asked about my thoughts or dreams, just painted pictures of what he decided my life should be. And now? Now I'm discovering who Eleanor Parker actually is when she's not trying to be what someone else expects. She met his eyes across the small space. I like her. She's braver than I thought, stronger. She can teach children and balance books and survive storms. She can do more than survive, James said softly. She can thrive. She can transform a whole town just by being herself. The storm was beginning to ease, thunder growing distant, rain softening from violent sheets to steady patter. Their clothes were still damp but wearable. The moment of decision had arrived. Stay in this intimate shelter or brave the weather to return to propriety. We should go, James said, though reluctance colored his voice. If we leave now, we can make town before full dark. Eleanor nodded, though part of her wanted to stay in this simple shack where the outside world and its judgments couldn't reach. She turned her back while James dressed, then he did the same for her, though the simple act of putting on still damp clothes while knowing he was just feet away made her fingers fumble with normally simple buttons. The ride back was quiet. Both lost in thoughts, neither was ready to share. The storm had washed the world clean, leaving everything fresh and gleaming in the late afternoon sun that broke through the dissipating clouds. Their horses picked their way carefully through muddy patches, and James stayed close to Eleanor, ready to help if Buttercup struggled. They were a mile from town when they encountered Margaret driving her buggy toward them, her face a mask of worry that transformed to relief when she saw them. Thank God, she called. I was about to organize a search party. Where did you shelter? The old line shack near Copper Creek, James said easily. Storm caught us by surprise. Margaret's eyes took in their still damp clothes, Eleanor's hair not quite properly pinned, the careful distance they were maintaining. Something knowing flickered in her expression, but she simply said, Well, get on back to town then. Rosa's keeping supper warm, and Eleanor, you need a hot bath before you catch your death. That night, after Eleanor had bathed and changed into dry clothes, She sat in her room brushing her hair and thinking about transformation. The woman who'd stood on that depot platform weeks ago wouldn't have survived today's storm. She would have panicked, wept, been paralyzed by the impropriety of the situation. But this new Eleanor had stayed calm, done what was necessary, found strength she didn't know she possessed. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Rosa entered with tea and a knowing smile. The storm, it brings truth, no? Shows what people are beneath the polish. What do you mean? Mr. James, he could have taken advantage, yes? Young woman, alone, grateful for rescue. Many men would, but he is honorable, keeps his distance, protects your reputation even when no one would know. Rosa set down the tea tray. This is how you know a man's character, not in his pretty words, but in his choices when no one watches. Eleanor thought about this as she sipped her tea. James had indeed been perfectly honorable, maintaining propriety even in impossible circumstances. But she'd also seen the way his eyes had traced her face in the firelight, felt the tension in the space between them, recognized the want that matched her own growing feelings. The next morning, at breakfast, O'Brien was full of jokes about the storm. Thought we'd lost our school teacher to the tempest. The children would have gone feral again for certain. It would take more than a storm to get rid of me, Eleanor said lightly. Though I appreciate the concern. James got you to shelter safely? Mr. Hoffman asked with his usual quiet interest. Yes, he was very protective. Something in her tone must have given her away because O'Brien grinned widely. Protective, was he now? Well, that's James McAllister for you. Man takes his responsibilities seriously. Timothy, Margaret warned, but there was amusement in her eyes. School that day was challenging, the children restless from being kept inside during the previous day's rain. Eleanor set them to writing essays about the storm, smiling at their dramatic descriptions of wind that could blow a cow clear to Kansas, and lightning that split the sky like God's own axe. Michael O'Brien's essay was particularly vivid, and she made a note to encourage his writing. The boy who'd started as her biggest challenge was becoming one of her most engaged students. Wednesday brought unexpected news when Margaret received a telegram that set her into a flurry of activity. My cousin Charlotte is coming to visit, she announced at dinner, from San Francisco of all places. Married some banking fellow. Apparently they're doing quite well. She'll be here Saturday. Charlotte's the one who tried to marry you off to that judge? James asked, having arrived for his midweek supply run. The very same. She'll probably spend the entire visit trying to convince me to sell the boarding house and move to California. Margaret's expression suggested she'd rather eat nails. Eleanor, I'll need your help entertaining her. She was always impressed by proper manners and education. Saturday arrived with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Charlotte Winters proved to be everything Margaret wasn't. Elaborate, dressed in the latest fashion, perfectly coiffed, speaking in the cultured tones of someone who'd worked hard to erase any trace of frontier origins. Margaret, darling, she cooed, air-kissing her cousin's cheeks. You look so sturdy. Country life obviously agrees with you. Her tone suggested this wasn't entirely a compliment. Her gaze fell on Eleanor, taking in her simple dress and work-worn hands with sharp assessment. And you must be the Boston girl Margaret mentioned in her letters. How enterprising of you to become a school teacher after your unfortunate circumstances. Eleanor felt her spine stiffen, but before she could respond, James appeared in the doorway. Charlotte's entire demeanor changed, her smile becoming genuinely warm. James McAllister, as I live and breathe, still as handsome as ever, I see. Such a shame about dear Sarah. You must be so lonely on that ranch all by yourself. I manage, James said coolly, moving to stand beside Eleanor in a gesture that wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Charlotte's eyes sharpened with interest. Oh, I see. How lovely. The weekend was an exercise in patience. Charlotte criticized everything from the boarding house's simple furnishings to the provincial nature of Willow Springs, all while dropping references to her husband's wealth and their sophisticated life in San Francisco. Of course, we're building a summer home in Napa, she said at Sunday dinner, addressing the entire table like an audience. The climate is so much more civilized than this wilderness. I keep telling Margaret she should visit, perhaps find a more suitable situation. A woman alone running a boarding house. It's hardly proper. Seems proper enough to me, O'Brien said bluntly. Margaret runs the finest establishment in 3 territories. Well, yes, for a frontier town, I suppose, Charlotte said dismissively. But surely you don't all plan to stay in this backwater forever. Miss Parker, certainly someone of your education must find this limiting. Eleanor set down her fork carefully. Actually, Mrs. Winters, I find Willow Springs remarkably expansive. In Boston, I was confined by countless rules about what a woman could and couldn't do. Here, I teach, I manage accounts, I contribute to the community in meaningful ways. That's not limiting, that's liberating. But surely you don't intend to remain a spinster schoolteacher indefinitely. Charlotte's gaze darted between Eleanor and James with obvious calculation. My intentions are my own business, Eleanor said calmly, but I'd rather be a spinster schoolteacher in Willow Springs than a decoration in someone's parlor anywhere else. James's hand found hers under the table, a brief squeeze of approval that sent warmth through her entire body. Charlotte left on Tuesday's early train, but not before pulling Eleanor aside with unsolicited advice. My dear, you could do so much better than a widowed rancher in Montana. With your looks and education, you could find a proper husband in San Francisco. I could introduce you. Mrs. Winters, Eleanor interrupted firmly. I came west to find a life of my own choosing. I found it. I don't need or want your introductions. Charlotte's expression soured. You'll regret it, mark my words. This frontier romance might seem appealing now, but when you're old before your time from the hard life, you'll wish you'd listened. After she left, the boarding house seemed to exhale collectively. Margaret collapsed in a chair with theatrical exhaustion. Every time she visits, I remember why I came to Montana in the first place, to get 3 territories away from her. She means well, Eleanor offered diplomatically. She means to manage everyone's life according to her standards, Margaret corrected, but you handled her beautifully. That comment about being a decoration? Perfect. James stayed for lunch, and afterward he and Eleanor walked to the schoolhouse so she could prepare for the afternoon's lessons. Once inside the empty classroom, he turned to her with an expression more serious than she'd seen before. Charlotte wasn't entirely wrong, he said quietly. Life out here is hard, especially on a ranch. It ages people, breaks them sometimes. Sarah was strong, but the isolation, the constant work, the uncertainties, they wore on her. Are you trying to warn me off? Eleanor asked, though her tone was gentle. I'm trying to be honest. You deserve to know what you'd be choosing if... He paused, then continued more firmly. Eleanor, I'm falling in love with you. Have been since that day at the depot, I think, though I tried to deny it. But I won't court you with pretty lies like Thomas did. Life with me would mean isolation, hard work, uncertainty. The ranch is 15 miles from town, sometimes snowed in for weeks in winter. It's beautiful, but lonely. Eleanor moved closer, reaching up to touch his face. James, I've had pretty lies and grand promises. They left me stranded and alone. I'd rather have difficult truth with someone I trust than easy fiction with someone I don't. Even if that truth means a life that Charlotte would call limiting? Especially then. Because what Charlotte doesn't understand is that limitations depend on perspective. Being bound to someone you love, building something together, facing hardships as a team, that's not limiting. That's the kind of expansiveness I couldn't find in all of Boston's drawing rooms. James caught her hand, pressing it against his cheek. Sarah would have liked you. She would have said you have grit, her highest compliment. I hope I can live up to that. You already have. He leaned down, and Eleanor thought he might kiss her, but the school bell chimed the hour, and they heard children's voices approaching. Saturday? James asked, stepping back to a proper distance. Saturday, Eleanor confirmed, though they both knew something fundamental had shifted between them, moving from possibility toward certainty. The week passed in a blur of teaching, bookkeeping, and trying not to think too constantly about James's declaration. The children seemed to sense her distraction, taking advantage with minor rebellions that she handled absently. Even Michael O'Brien managed to sneak a frog into the classroom, though she simply incorporated it into an impromptu biology lesson. Thursday brought rain that kept her from her usual evening walk, So she sat in the parlor with the other boarders, listening to O'Brien and Mr. Hoffman play their instruments while Rosa taught Mr. Chen's son to dance. It was domestic and peaceful, the kind of evening she'd never experienced in Uncle Clarence's cold house or as a governess in the Hartwell mansion. "You look content," Mr. Chen observed, sitting beside her with his usual quiet grace. "I am," Eleanor realized with some surprise. "More content than I've ever been." "Contentment is not about having everything," he said in his thoughtful way. "It's about recognizing the value of what you have." "And I have more than I ever expected when I stepped off that train," Eleanor admitted. "Yet you still want more?" It wasn't criticism, just observation. "Is it wrong to want more when you're already grateful for what you have?" Mr. Chen smiled. Gratitude and ambition can exist together. The key is ensuring one doesn't poison the other. Friday evening, Margaret pulled Eleanor aside after supper. "James sent word. He wants to show you the ranch tomorrow. The actual ranch, not just rides around the countryside." Eleanor's heart jumped. Visiting his ranch felt significant, like crossing a threshold from courtship into something more serious. "What do you think?" "I think my brother doesn't invite people to the ranch. Hasn't since Sarah died. The fact that he wants to show it to you means something." Margaret studied her carefully. "The question is whether you're ready for what it means." That night, Eleanor barely slept. She knew that tomorrow would be pivotal, that James was offering her a glimpse of what life with him would actually entail. No more romantic rides to scenic spots, but the reality of the working ranch that would define her days if she chose him. Saturday dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect June day that made Montana look like paradise. James arrived early, his expression serious but his eyes warm when they found Eleanor. "It's a longer ride," he warned, "and the ranch, it's not fancy. It's just a working spread, built for function, not beauty." "I'm not looking for fancy," Eleanor reminded him. "I've had enough of facades to last a lifetime." The ride took 2 hours, following trails through valleys and over ridges, the landscape gradually changing from the settled areas near town to wilder country. They talked little, both understanding that this journey was about more than just covering distance. Finally, they crested a rise, and James pulled up his horse. There it is, Sweetwater Ranch. The ranch spread below them in a valley bisected by a clear stream. The house was modest but solid, built of logs with a stone chimney and a wide porch facing the mountains. There were barns, corrals, a bunkhouse for hands, all arranged with practical efficiency. Cattle dotted the pastures, and Eleanor could see horses in a nearby paddock. "It's perfect," she said softly, meaning it. James's expression showed surprise and relief. "You haven't seen the inside yet, and the barn needs repair. The fences constantly need mending. James?" Eleanor interrupted gently. "I see a home built with care, land that's been well managed, a place where life has been lived honestly. That's beautiful to me." They rode down to the house, and James helped her dismount with hands that lingered a moment at her waist. The porch was deep and welcoming, with a bench that faced the sunset and hooks for coats and equipment. The door was solid oak, carved with simple designs that spoke of craftsmanship. Inside, Eleanor could see Sarah's influence everywhere, from the carefully arranged kitchen to the quilts on the furniture. But there was dust, too, the slight neglect of a house where only one person lived, and that person spent most of his time outdoors. "I haven't changed much," James said, almost apologetically. "Couldn't bring myself to at first, and then it just became easier to leave things as they were." Eleanor moved through the room slowly, seeing both what was and what could be. The bones of the house were good. Solid construction, thoughtful layout, plenty of windows to let in light. It needed attention, care, a woman's touch, but not in the decorative way Charlotte would have meant. It needed someone to make it alive again. "Show me the rest," she said. They toured the outbuildings, James explaining the operation, the challenges of ranch life, the isolation during winter storms. He introduced her to his 2 ranch hands, Tom and Eddie, young men who seemed devoted to James and curious about Eleanor. He showed her the horses he was training, the creek where Sarah had planted a vegetable garden that had gone wild, the rise where they planned to build a larger barn. "It's a lot of work," James said as they stood by the creek. "Endless, really. Something always needs fixing or tending. Sarah used to say the ranch was like a demanding child that never grew up. But you love it. I do. It's honest work, building something that lasts. Every improvement, every successful season, every new foal, it all adds up to something bigger than just survival. Eleanor knelt by the abandoned garden, pulling away dead growth to reveal green shoots underneath, volunteers from Sarah's original plantings still trying to grow. Things want to live, she said softly. Even neglected things, given half a chance. When she stood, James was watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. Eleanor, I need to know, could you be happy here? Really happy, not just making the best of it? She looked around at the mountains that stood like guardians, at the creek singing over stones, at the house waiting to be loved again, at the man who'd saved her from despair and offered her something real instead of pretty lies. I could be more than happy, she said. I could be home. James crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, his hands framing her face. I love you, he said simply, not with poetry or promises I can't keep, but with everything I have and am. It's not much, a ranch, a hope for the future, a heart that's been broken but still works. But it's yours if you want it. James? Eleanor whispered, tears she didn't try to hide sliding down her cheeks. It's everything. You're everything. He kissed her then, there by the creek where his first wife had planted gardens, where life persisted despite neglect, where the future waited to be built. It wasn't Eleanor's first kiss. Thomas's fictional persona had inspired a few chaste embraces with local Boston boys when she was younger, but it was the first that felt real, grounded, true. When they pulled apart, both breathing unsteadily, James rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, he said, not because you need rescue or I need a ranch wife, but because I can't imagine facing another Montana winter without you, because you make me want to be better than I am, because you see beauty where others see only hard work. Yes, Eleanor said without hesitation. Yes to the ranch, yes to the work, yes to the winters, yes to you, James McAllister. They stayed at the ranch until late afternoon, making plans with the giddy energy of people whose lives had suddenly expanded with possibility. The garden would be restored, the house refreshed without erasing Sarah's memory, a room prepared for the children they both hoped would come. James would teach Eleanor to shoot and ride properly. She would teach any children in the valley who wanted to learn their letters. The ride back to town was different from the morning's journey. They rode close together, hands occasionally touching. The future spreading before them like the grassland itself, vast, challenging, but theirs to shape. As they approached Willow Springs, reality began to intrude. There would be talk, of course. The school teacher and the widowed rancher courting for only 2 months before deciding to marry. Some would say Eleanor was desperate, James lonely, both settling for convenience rather than love. Are you ready for the gossip? James asked, reading her thoughts. Let them talk, Eleanor said with a confidence that surprised her. They didn't see me on that depot platform, didn't see you offer kindness without expectation. They don't know what we've built from that moment. Margaret was waiting on the boarding house porch, Rosa beside her, both women standing as James and Eleanor approached. Something in their faces, the way they held themselves, must have told the story because Margaret's expression shifted from curiosity to joy. When? Was all she asked. As soon as possible, James said, helping Eleanor dismount. I've waited 3 years to start living again. I don't want to wait any longer. August, Eleanor suggested, after the school term ends when the harvest is in. A new beginning with the new season. August it is, James agreed and kissed her again, right there in front of the boarding house where anyone could see, declaring to the world that Eleanor Parker was his choice, his future, his unexpected gift from a God who sometimes worked through mysterious ways. That evening, the boarding house celebrated with impromptu festivities. O'Brien played every love song he knew. Mr. Hoffman contributed a surprisingly emotional violin solo, and Rosa cooked a feast that had everyone groaning with satisfied fullness. Mr. Chen offered a toast in carefully practiced English about destiny and courage, while his son shyly gave Eleanor a drawing of the schoolhouse with "Congratulations, Miss Parker," written in his best hand. You'll need a wedding dress, Margaret said practically. We can send to Denver for fabric, or Eleanor thought of the white silk dress in her trunk, sewn with such hope for a different wedding, a different life. I have one, she said quietly. It might need alterations, but I have one. Later, alone in her room, she pulled out the dress she'd made for Thomas Whitmore. The silk was still pristine, the pearl buttons still gleaming, but it looked different to her now. Not a symbol of foolish dreams, but of resilience, of a journey that had led her through deception to truth, through abandonment to real love. She would wear it to marry James, this dress sewn with hope that had been disappointed, then redirected. It seemed fitting somehow, nothing wasted, everything transformed. The news of their engagement spread through Willow Springs like wildfire on dry grass. By Monday morning, Eleanor faced a classroom of children whose eyes sparkled with barely contained curiosity. Even her usually best-behaved students whispered behind their hands, and Michael O'Brien finally burst out with what everyone was thinking. "Miss Parker, is it true you're going to marry Mr. McAllister and leave us?" Eleanor set down her chalk carefully, turning to face the anxious faces. "I am going to marry Mr. McAllister," she confirmed, watching as excitement and dismay warred on young faces. "But I'm not leaving you. After the wedding, I'll be living at the ranch, but there are children in that valley who need schooling too. I'm hoping to start a small school there, and any of you who want to continue learning will always be welcome." "But it's so far," little Emma Chen said, her voice wobbling. 15 miles seems like forever when you're 7, Eleanor said gently, kneeling beside the girl's desk. "But I promise you'll see me. I'll come to town regularly, and perhaps some Saturdays your parents might bring you out to the ranch for lessons and lemonade." The idea of visiting a real ranch brightened several faces, and Eleanor managed to redirect their attention to arithmetic, though she caught them stealing glances at her throughout the day, as if she might vanish in a puff of wedding smoke at any moment. That afternoon, Mrs. Patterson arrived at the schoolhouse just as Eleanor was dismissing the children. The older woman's expression was unreadable as she waited for the last student to leave before speaking. "So you're following in Miss Collins's footsteps after all," she said, though her tone was more resigned than accusatory. "Not quite," Eleanor replied. "Miss Collins ran off without warning, leaving you scrambling. I'm giving you 2 months' notice, and I plan to help find and train my replacement. Moreover, I intend to continue teaching, just in a different capacity." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose. "Explain." Eleanor outlined her plan for the Valley School, how she'd teach ranch children whose families couldn't send them to town regularly. "Education shouldn't be limited by geography," she finished. "Those children deserve the same chance to learn as the ones in town." "And James supports this notion?" "It was partly his idea. He's seen too many ranch families struggle because the parents can't read contracts or calculate properly. He wants better for the valley." Mrs. Patterson studied her for a long moment, then surprised Eleanor by smiling. "You know, Miss Parker, when you first arrived, I thought you'd last perhaps a month. City girl, broken heart, desperate circumstances. It seemed a recipe for disaster, but you've proven me wrong at every turn." "Thank you, I think." "It's a compliment, girl. Takes strength to rebuild a life from ashes. Takes more strength to do it while serving others." She moved toward the door, then paused. "I'll write to my niece in Colorado. She's been looking for a teaching position, and if she's half as capable as you've proven to be, she'll do nicely." The following days brought a stream of visitors to the boarding house, women ostensibly calling on Margaret, but really hoping to glean details about the wedding. Eleanor endured their questions with patience, understanding that in a frontier town, any wedding was entertainment, but a wedding rising from such dramatic circumstances was practically a theatrical production. "Will you wear white?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her tone suggesting she thought it might be inappropriate for a woman who'd arrived as a failed mail-order bride. "Yes," Eleanor said simply, offering no further explanation. "And the ceremony? Surely something simple given the circumstances." "We haven't decided yet," Eleanor said, though she and James had actually discussed having the ceremony at the ranch, by the creek where he'd proposed. But that was private, theirs, not for public consumption. Rosa proved to be Eleanor's greatest ally during these interrogations, swooping in with urgent tasks whenever the questions became too intrusive. "Miss Eleanor, the stove needs your attention," she'd say, or "the books require immediate review," and Eleanor would escape gratefully to manufactured emergencies. James came to town more frequently now, finding reasons to deliver supplies or check on orders that could have waited. He endured the good-natured ribbing from the men at the general store, the knowing looks from matrons, the occasional warning from well-meaning folks about rushing into marriage. "You sure about this, McAllister?" asked Ben Stevens, who ran the feed store. "You barely know the woman. What if she's not what she seems?" James's response became legend in Willow Springs. "Ben," he said calmly, "I knew my horse for 5 minutes before I bought him, and he's been the best decision I ever made. Sometimes you just recognize quality when you see it." But not everyone was supportive. Eleanor encountered her first real hostility one evening when she was walking back from the general store. A woman she didn't recognize stepped out from the saloon's shadow, pretty in a hard way, with paint on her face and a dress that suggested her profession. "You're the school teacher," the woman said, not making it a question. "I am. Can I help you?" "Help me?" The woman laughed bitterly. "That's rich. You've already helped yourself to the only decent man in 3 territories, so I'd say you've done enough." Eleanor understood then. This woman had hoped, perhaps for years, that James might notice her after his morning passed. "I'm sorry," she said genuinely. "I didn't come here intending—" "No, you came here chasing after some liar, and when that fell through, you set your sights on James. Don't pretend it's some grand love story. You needed a man. He needed a wife for that ranch. At least be honest about it." The words stung because they contained enough truth to hurt. Eleanor had needed rescue. James had been lonely. But that wasn't all of it, wasn't even most of it. "You're right that we both needed something," Eleanor said carefully, "but need and love aren't mutually exclusive. Sometimes need opens the door for love to enter." "Pretty words," the woman spat. "You educated types always have pretty words. But when ranch life gets hard, when you're isolated and exhausted and he's more interested in cattle than conversation, remember that some of us would have been grateful for that life." She walked away before Eleanor could respond, leaving her shaken. That night she told James about the encounter as they sat on the boarding house porch, the evening sounds of the town drifting around them. "That would be Lily," James said quietly. "She's been at the Silver Dollar for 5 years. Lost her husband in a mining accident, turned to the only work available. She's spoken to me a few times, made her interest clear." "And you never—" "No. She's a good woman in bad circumstances, but I couldn't offer what she needed, respectability, a way out of that life. Marrying a saloon girl, even a widow forced into it, would have destroyed both our reputations. The ranch would have suffered, business would have dried up." He sighed. "It seems cruel, but this world has cruel rules." "But you're marrying me, and I arrived as a failed mail-order bride. How is that more respectable?" James turned to look at her directly. "Because you never compromised yourself, even when desperate. You took honest work, taught children, helped Margaret. You proved yourself through actions, not just circumstances. That matters out here." Eleanor thought about Lily, about the thin lines between respectability and ruin, about how easily she could have fallen on the other side of that line if James hadn't appeared at the depot. "It's not fair," she said softly. "No," James agreed. "It's not. But fairness is a luxury the frontier doesn't often afford." They sat in silence, both thinking about the harsh realities beneath Willow Springs' veneer of civilization. Finally, James spoke again. "There's something else we need to discuss. My brother is coming for the wedding." Eleanor had heard about Patrick McAllister, younger than James, a doctor in San Francisco, successful and sophisticated. "You sound worried." "Patrick thinks I should sell the ranch, move to California, start over in civilization. He's been pushing harder since Sarah died. He'll see our marriage as either the final nail in my Montana coffin or a sign I'm ready to leave." "What will you tell him?" "The truth. That I'm marrying a woman who sees the beauty in this life, who doesn't want to change me or move me or civilize me. That I'm happier than I've been in 3 years. And if he doesn't approve?" James took her hand. "Then he doesn't approve. I spent 3 years living for the dead, Eleanor. I won't spend another minute living for anyone's approval but our own." July arrived with heat that shimmered off the grasslands and made the schoolhouse stifling by noon. Eleanor adapted, starting lessons earlier, dismissing the children during the worst heat, sometimes holding class under the large oak behind the building. The children were distracted by summer's call and the approaching end of term, but also by the romance unfolding before them. "Miss Parker, will you wear flowers in your hair?" Emma Chen asked one afternoon. "Are you going to cry at your wedding?" Michael O'Brien wanted to know. "My ma cried through her whole ceremony," Dad said. "Will Mr. McAllister carry you over the threshold?" This from Jenny Patterson, Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter, who'd been reading too many romantic novels. Eleanor answered when she could, redirected when necessary, and found herself charmed by their innocent interest in the mechanics of adult romance. She was less charmed when she overheard Michael telling the younger boys that marriage meant kissing all the time and having to wash regular-like, which led to an impromptu lesson on respect and privacy that had all the boys squirming. Margaret threw herself into wedding preparations with an enthusiasm that would have been alarming if it weren't so helpful. She coordinated with Rosa on food, bullied the general store into ordering special items from Denver, and began transforming the boarding house for the reception. "We'll have it here," she declared, brooking no argument. "The ceremony at the ranch for family and close friends, then everyone back here for a proper celebration. The whole town will want to wish you well." "Margaret, that's too much trouble." "Nonsense. My brother is getting married again, something I thought I'd never see. We're going to do this properly." The white silk dress was carefully altered, Rosa working her magic with needle and thread to make it fit Eleanor's figure perfectly. The style was perhaps too formal for a ranch wedding, but Eleanor didn't care. This dress had carried her hopes across the continent. It would see them fulfilled, just differently than originally planned. 2 weeks before the wedding, a letter arrived that made Eleanor's hands shake. The return address was Boston, Uncle Clarence's precise handwriting unmistakable. She opened it in the privacy of her room, bracing for condemnation. "Eleanor," it read, "your letter was brief but clear. You have found employment, and I gather a life of your own choosing. I will not pretend I approve of your methods or decisions. However, I must acknowledge a certain admiration for your tenacity. Your mother had the same stubborn streak, though she learned to hide it better. I have enclosed a bank draft for $200. It is not charity, but rather your portion of the recent sale of your father's remaining business assets, which I managed to recover after considerable effort. Use it wisely. I do not expect we will correspond again, but know that despite our differences, I wish you well in your frontier life. Your Aunt Elizabeth sends her regards. Clarence Morrison." Eleanor stared at the bank draft. A fortune by her current standards. $200 would buy livestock, improvements for the ranch, security against bad years. But more than the money, it was the grudging respect in her uncle's words that made her eyes fill. He would never say he was proud of her, but this was as close as Clarence Morrison could come to approval. She showed James the letter that evening, watched his eyes widen at the amount. "That changes things," he said carefully. "You could be independent with that money. You don't have to marry me for security." Eleanor took his face in her hands. "James McAllister, I thought we established I'm not marrying you for security. I'm marrying you because you make me laugh, because you see me clearly, because you offered kindness without expectation. The money doesn't change that. It just means we can buy those horses you've been wanting and maybe glass windows for the kitchen." He kissed her then, deeply, passionately, right there on Main Street where anyone could see. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, he said, "Glass windows and horses. You really do understand me." Patrick McAllister arrived 3 days before the wedding, stepping off the train looking like he'd brought San Francisco with him. Tall like James, but lean where his brother was broad, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Eleanor's entire wardrobe, he surveyed Willow Springs with barely concealed dismay. "James," he said, embracing his brother briefly, "you look well? Ranch life still agrees with you, I see." "It does," James said simply. "Patrick, this is Eleanor." Patrick's assessment was thorough and not entirely friendly. "Miss Parker, I've heard so much about you, the mysterious woman from Boston who captured my brother's heart in record time." 2 months is hardly record time, Eleanor said calmly. "People have married with less acquaintance. And lived to regret it." "Patrick," James warned, "I'm simply pointing out that my brother has a ranch worth considerable money, and it's natural to wonder about the motivations of someone who arrives penniless and leaves married to property." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her voice level. You're right to be protective of your brother. Families should look out for each other. But if you think I'm after his money, you're welcome to investigate my circumstances. You'll find I've been supporting myself through teaching and bookkeeping, that I've refused charity when offered, and that I actually have my own resources now. I'm marrying James because I love him, not his ranch. Love, Patrick said skeptically. After 2 months. After a lifetime of knowing what love isn't, Eleanor shot back. I've seen false love, desperate love, practical love. What I have with James is none of those things. It's true and strong and worth defending, even from well-meaning brothers. Something shifted in Patrick's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or grudging respect. You're not what I expected, he admitted. Good, Eleanor said. James deserves better than expected. The evening before the wedding, Willow Springs threw an impromptu party at the boarding house. O'Brien played his guitar, Mr. Hoffman his violin, and someone had brought a fiddle. Dancing spilled out onto the porch and into the street. Eleanor danced with what felt like every man in town, from shy Mr. Chen to boisterous miners to Frederick Hoffman, who surprised everyone with his grace. A man of many hidden talents, Eleanor said as he guided her through a waltz. We all have hidden depths, he replied with a small smile. Even accountants. I'm glad you're staying in the area, Miss Parker. Or should I say, soon to be Mrs. McAllister. This town would be dimmer without you. James claimed her for the last dance, a slow melody that O'Brien sang in Irish, the words unknown but the sentiment clear. They swayed together, oblivious to the watching crowd, lost in the promise of tomorrow. Nervous? James whispered. Terrified, Eleanor admitted, but the good kind of terrified. The kind that means you're about to do something that matters. Sarah used to say that fear and excitement are the same feeling, just wearing different clothes. Sarah was wise. She was. She would have liked you, I think, would have said you have good sense and better courage. As the evening wound down, Margaret pulled Eleanor aside. I have something for you. She pressed a small box into Eleanor's hands. Inside was a delicate silver locket, worn smooth with age. This was our mother's. I wore it at my wedding. Sarah wore it at hers. It should be worn at James's second wedding, too. Eleanor's eyes filled. Margaret, I couldn't. You can and you will. You're family now, or will be tomorrow. Mother would have been pleased to see James happy again. The wedding day dawned perfect, the August sky a brilliant blue that seemed to go on forever. Eleanor woke early, too excited to sleep, and found Rosa already in the kitchen with coffee and sweet rolls. For the nerves, Rosa said, pushing a cup into Eleanor's hands. Though you have nothing to fear, I have seen many marriages, and this one has truth in it. Margaret helped Eleanor dress, her efficient hands gentle as she fastened the pearl buttons, arranged the veil Eleanor had made from Belgian lace she'd been saving since Boston. You're beautiful, Margaret said softly. But more than that, you're radiant. That's what love does. Makes us shine from the inside. The ride to the ranch was dreamlike. Eleanor and Margaret's buggy with Rosa and Mrs. Patterson, who'd surprisingly insisted on attending. The men had ridden ahead, and Eleanor could see them gathered by the creek, James standing with the Reverend, Patrick beside him as best man. As Margaret helped her down from the buggy, Eleanor saw that someone, probably James and his ranch hands, had built an arbor of wildflowers and sage beside the creek. The small gathering of their closest friends stood in a semicircle, the mountains rising behind them like witnesses. O'Brien, dressed in his finest, which still wasn't very fine, offered his arm. Since you've no father here, thought you might need someone to walk you. If you'll have an old Irishman, that is. I'd be honored, Eleanor said, taking his arm gratefully. The walk to James seemed both eternal and instant. She saw Patrick's surprised approval at her appearance, Mrs. Patterson dabbing her eyes, Mr. Chen and his family beaming, the ranch hands grinning. But mostly she saw James, his face transformed with joy and something like awe as she approached. You came, he said softly when she reached him. Did you doubt? Never. But seeing you here in this place, wearing that dress, it's like every broken piece of the last 3 years just mended itself. Reverend Mills cleared his throat. Dearly beloved, we gather today beside the waters that sustain this land, beneath the sky that shelters it, to join Eleanor Parker and James McAllister in holy matrimony. The ceremony was simple, their vows traditional with personal additions. James promised not just to love and cherish, but to respect Eleanor's mind and support her dreams. Eleanor promised not just to honor and obey, but to build beside him and find joy in the journey. When Reverend Mills pronounced them married, James kissed her with a tenderness that had Rosa crying and O'Brien cheering. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reverend Mills announced with a smile, "I present Mr. and Mrs. James McAllister." The reception at the boarding house was a blur of congratulations, food, dancing, and laughter. The entire town seemed to have crowded in, even those who'd been skeptical now caught up in the celebration. Eleanor changed into a simpler dress for dancing, and she and James led the first dance to thunderous applause. "No regrets?" James asked as they waltzed to Hoffman's violin. "Only that we didn't meet sooner," Eleanor replied. "Then we might not have been ready for each other. Sarah used to say timing is everything, that people meet when they're meant to, not before." Eleanor thought about the woman she'd been in Boston, the desperate girl on the depot platform, the gradually strengthening person she'd become in Willow Springs. She was right. We met exactly when we should have. As the afternoon wore on, Patrick approached Eleanor where she was catching her breath between dances. "I owe you an apology," he said stiffly. "I misjudged you." "You were protecting your brother, I understand." "It's more than that." He looked across the room to where James was laughing with O'Brien. "I haven't seen him laugh like that since Sarah died. Haven't seen him look forward instead of back. You've given him something I couldn't, a reason to live instead of just survive." "He gave me the same thing," Eleanor said softly. Patrick smiled then, the first genuine warmth she'd seen from him. "Then you're well matched. I still think ranch life is insane, but if anyone can make it work, it's you two stubborn fools." As evening approached, Eleanor and James prepared to leave for the ranch. Their friends gathered outside the boarding house, throwing rice and flower petals, calling out blessings and good wishes. James helped Eleanor onto the wagon seat. They'd return for her belongings tomorrow, but tonight it would be just them. "Ready to go home?" he asked. "I've been ready since that first day you showed it to me," Eleanor replied. The ride to the ranch was quiet, both of them processing the day's emotions. As they crested the final ridge and the ranch spread below them in the golden evening light, Eleanor felt something settle in her chest, a sense of rightness, of arrival, of journey's end and beginning all at once. James carried her over the threshold as tradition demanded, both of them laughing when he nearly tripped on the doorframe. The house had been cleaned and prepared by the ranch hands, wildflowers in mason jars on every surface, the bed made with new linens Margaret had insisted on providing. "Welcome home, Mrs. McAllister," James said softly, setting her down but keeping her in his arms. "That's going to take some getting used to," Eleanor admitted. "We have time," James said, kissing her gently. "All the time in the world." Later, as they lay together in the quiet house, moonlight streaming through the windows Eleanor would soon replace with glass, she thought about the strange path that had brought her here. Thomas Whitmore's betrayal had seemed like the end of everything, but it had actually been the beginning. Every moment of desperation and struggle had led to this, to James's arms, to this ranch, to a life built on truth instead of fantasy. "What are you thinking?" James asked, his voice drowsy with contentment. "About journeys," Eleanor said. "About how the ones we plan are rarely the ones we take." "And the one you took?" "Led me exactly where I belong." Outside, a nightbird called, and the creek sang its eternal song. The ranch settled around them, protective and permanent, a testament to hard work and hope. Tomorrow would bring chores and challenges, the reality of ranch life in all its demanding glory. But tonight, Eleanor Parker McAllister lay in her marriage bed, held by a man who'd seen her at her lowest and lifted her up, and knew that every broken dream had been worth it for this single, perfect reality. The depot at Silver Creek seemed like something from another life, another woman's story. That woman had been left alone, abandoned by lies and empty promises. But she'd been found by truth, claimed by love, and given something better than she'd ever dared imagine. The cowboy had indeed bought her fair. and her journey had indeed ended with him, not in the way she'd expected, but in the way she'd needed. The first winter as Mrs. McAllister tested Eleanor in ways she hadn't anticipated. November brought early snows that isolated the ranch for 2 weeks, cutting them off from town completely. She stood at the kitchen window watching the white expanse stretch endlessly, understanding for the first time what James had meant about the loneliness of ranch life. "Having second thoughts?" James asked, coming up behind her, his arms encircling her waist. "No," Eleanor said firmly, leaning back against his warmth. "Just understanding why Sarah planted so many flowers. She was fighting back against all this white emptiness. She said flowers were proof that beauty could exist anywhere, even in the harshest places." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Like you." Eleanor turned in his arms. "James McAllister, are you comparing me to a flower?" "More like a whole garden," he said with that slow smile she'd come to treasure. "Beautiful, but also practical. Flowers and vegetables both." And she laughed, the sound filling the kitchen that had become truly hers over the past months. She'd kept much of Sarah's arrangement, but added her own touches. Uncle Clarence's money had bought those glass windows, and sunlight now streamed in even on the coldest days. The garden she'd restored had provided well through the fall, and her pantry was stocked with preserved goods that would see them through winter. The isolation brought unexpected intimacies. With the ranch hands snowed into the bunkhouse and no visitors able to reach them, Eleanor and James existed in a private world. They talked through long evenings by the fire, James teaching her to work leather while she read aloud from the books she'd brought from Boston. They played chess with a set James had carved during his first winter alone after Sarah, and Eleanor discovered her husband had a strategic mind that made him a formidable opponent. "You're thinking 6 moves ahead," she accused one evening after he'd trapped her king with elegant efficiency. "Ranch life teaches you to plan ahead," he replied. "One mistake in summer means starving cattle in winter." But it was during those snow-locked weeks that Eleanor truly began to understand the depth of James's grief for Sarah, and how carefully he was navigating his new happiness. She found him one morning standing in what had been Sarah's sewing room, holding a half-finished quilt. "She was making this when the fever took her," he said quietly. "I haven't been able to bring myself to throw it away, but I also can't stand seeing it unfinished." Eleanor took the quilt gently, examining the pattern. A wedding ring design in blues and greens. "Would you mind if I finished it?" James's eyes widened. "You'd do that? Sarah was part of your life, part of what made you who you are. Finishing her work isn't betraying our marriage, it's honoring what came before." She traced the careful stitches. "Besides, it's beautiful work. It deserves to be completed." That evening, she sat by the fire working on Sarah's quilt while James read the newspaper from 2 weeks ago, the last one they'd received before the snow. It should have felt strange, completing another woman's work in another woman's house, but instead it felt like a conversation across time. 2 women who loved the same man finding a way to coexist peacefully. The snow finally cleared in early December, and James and the hands dug out a path to town. Eleanor rode beside him, eager for news and supplies, but also strangely reluctant to leave their cocoon. In town, they found Margaret frantically preparing for Christmas, the boarding house full of stranded travelers who'd been caught by the early storms. "Eleanor, thank God you're all right. I was imagining you frozen solid out there," Margaret embraced her sister-in-law warmly. "We managed quite well," Eleanor assured her, "though I'll admit I'm grateful for conversation that isn't about cattle prices or fence repairs." "How dare you?" James said with mock offense. "My cattle price discussions are riveting." The trip to town brought unexpected news, a letter waiting at the post office that made Eleanor's hands tremble. The return address was from Daniel Morrison, the man who'd tried to give her money to absolve his conscience about Thomas Whitmore's deception. "What does he want now?" James asked, protective anger coloring his voice. Eleanor read quickly, then slower, then handed the letter to James with shaking hands. "Thomas is dead. Killed in a saloon fight in Sacramento. Daniel thought I should know." James read the brief, clinical description of Thomas Whitmore's end. A dispute over cards, a knife, a man bleeding out on a sawdust floor while the game continued around him. "How do you feel about this?" Eleanor considered carefully. The man who'd written those beautiful letters, who'd painted pictures of a future that had drawn her across a continent, that man had never really existed. The real Thomas had been a confidence man who died as he'd lived, among strangers and schemes. I feel nothing, she realized with surprise. He's just a character from a story that happened to someone else. The woman who mourned those letters, who believed those lies, she doesn't exist anymore either. Good, James said firmly, throwing the letter into the boarding house stove. Let the dead bury the dead. Christmas at the ranch was magical in ways Eleanor hadn't expected. James had secretly been working on something in the barn, and on Christmas morning, he led her outside to reveal a beautiful sleigh he'd restored. It was Sarah's father's, he explained. Been sitting in the barn gathering dust. Thought maybe it was time it saw use again. They bundled themselves in buffalo robes and flew across the snow-covered landscape, the bells on the horses' harnesses singing in the cold air. They delivered presents to the neighboring ranches, preserves Eleanor had made, leather goods James had crafted during the long evenings. Each stop meant warm greetings, hot cider, and invitations to stay that they politely declined. You're good for him, Mrs. Hendrickson said quietly to Eleanor while James discussed spring breeding plans with her husband. Haven't seen him this easy in years. Sarah would be pleased. It was a refrain Eleanor heard often, this assurance that Sarah would approve. At first it had felt strange being constantly measured against a ghost, but she'd come to understand it was the frontier's way of accepting her, of weaving her into the fabric of a community that valued continuity even in the face of constant change. January brought a different kind of challenge. Eleanor discovered she was pregnant, the morning sickness hitting her with violent suddenness. She managed to hide it from James for a week, but he caught her retching behind the chicken coop one morning and put the pieces together immediately. How long have you known? He asked, his face a mixture of joy and concern. 2 weeks, maybe 3. I wanted to be sure before I told you. He pulled her into his arms, holding her with careful tenderness. A baby. Our baby. Due in summer, I think, July or August. James was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor knew he was thinking of Sarah, who'd lost 2 pregnancies before the fever took her. We'll get you to town to see Doc Watson, he said firmly. And if you need to stay with Margaret closer to your time, James, Eleanor interrupted gently, I'm strong, I'm healthy, and I'm not going anywhere. This ranch is our home. Our child will be born here. The pregnancy changed the rhythm of their days. James became almost comically protective, trying to prevent her from lifting anything heavier than a teacup, until Eleanor firmly reminded him that pioneer women had been having babies while maintaining homesteads for generations. They compromised. She would avoid the heaviest work, but wouldn't be treated like an invalid. The morning sickness passed by February, replaced by an energy that had Eleanor attacking projects with renewed vigor. She organized a school for the Valley children, holding classes 3 afternoons a week in her own parlor. 5 children attended regularly, their parents grateful for education that didn't require the long journey to town. You're creating a community, James observed one evening after the children had gone home, making this valley into more than just scattered ranches. Is that all right? Eleanor asked, suddenly uncertain. I know you value the isolation. I valued isolation when I was grieving, James corrected. Now I value life, and life means connection. Besides, he added with a grin, our child will need playmates. March brought an unexpected visitor. Eleanor was teaching the Valley children when a rider approached. A woman, riding astride like a man, dressed in practical clothing that scandalized even Eleanor's frontier-adjusted sensibilities. She dismounted with easy grace and approached the house with confident strides. You must be Eleanor, the woman said without preamble. I'm Catherine Burke. I own the ranch to the south. Heard James finally remarried and thought it was time to introduce myself. Catherine Burke was unlike any woman Eleanor had met, weathered, direct, and utterly uninterested in conventional femininity. She ran her ranch alone after her husband's death 5 years ago, refusing all offers to buy her out or marry her way to security. People think I'm crazy, Catherine said over coffee while the children completed their lessons. A woman alone running 800 head of cattle, but I'd rather be crazy and free than sane and subjected." "Don't you get lonely?" Eleanor asked. "Sometimes, but loneliness is a small price for autonomy." She studied Eleanor with sharp eyes. "You're not what I expected. Heard you were some delicate Eastern flower James rescued from disaster." "I was," Eleanor said honestly, "but I've developed thorns since then." Catherine laughed, a rich, genuine sound. "Good. You'll need them. This land doesn't suffer fools or weaklings. Speaking of which, when are you due?" Eleanor started. She wasn't showing yet, or so she'd thought. "How did you know?" "The way James watches you, like you might evaporate if he blinks. Men only get that stupid when their women are carrying." The friendship that developed with Catherine became one of Eleanor's greatest unexpected gifts. The older woman visited monthly, bringing news from the Southern Valley, sharing her hard-won wisdom about surviving as a woman in a man's world. "Never apologize for your strength," Catherine advised during one visit. "Men out here say they want a delicate lady, but what they need is a partner who can shoot a rattlesnake, birth a calf, and still have dinner on the table. You're that kind of woman, even if you didn't know it when you arrived." April brought the spring roundup, and Eleanor insisted on participating despite James's protests and her expanding middle. She couldn't ride the way the men did, but she managed the camp, cooking for the dozen extra hands they'd hired, keeping track of the tallies, tending injuries that ranged from minor cuts to a broken arm when a horse threw its rider. "You're something else, Mrs. McAllister," Tom, one of the permanent ranch hands, said as she set his dislocated finger with efficient precision. "Most ladies would faint at the sight of blood." "I'm not most ladies," Eleanor replied, wrapping the finger carefully. And fainting never fixed anything. It was during the roundup that Eleanor first felt the baby move, a flutter like butterfly wings that made her gasp and press her hand to her stomach. James was beside her instantly. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. The baby moved. Here." She placed his hand where she'd felt the movement, and they waited breathlessly until it came again, stronger this time. James's face transformed with wonder. "Our child," he whispered, "real and alive." "Getting more real every day," Eleanor agreed, then groaned as her back twinged. "And heavier. May turned the ranch into a paradise of wildflowers and green grass." Eleanor's garden exploded with growth, and she spent every morning that her energy allowed tending vegetables and the flowers she'd planted in Sarah's memory. The Valley School had grown to 8 students, and Mrs. Patterson sent word that the teacher she'd hired was working out well, but missed Eleanor's natural gift with the children. "You could go back," James said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "After the baby comes, if you wanted to teach in town again." "My life is here," Eleanor interrupted. "My school is here, small as it is. My home, my husband, soon our child. I don't need the town school to feel useful." "You've never regretted it? Choosing this isolated life over the community in town?" Eleanor thought about the question seriously. "Sometimes I miss the convenience, the easy company. But Margaret visits, Catherine has become a dear friend, and the ranch families treat me as one of their own. It's a different kind of community, but no less real." June arrived with oppressive heat that made Eleanor's pregnancy increasingly uncomfortable. She could no longer hide her condition, her belly round and prominent, her gait the distinctive waddle of late pregnancy. Doc Watson visited, pronouncing her healthy but warning that first babies often came late. "Could be August before this little one arrives," he said, making Eleanor groan. "August? I'll melt by then." "You'll survive," the doctor said with the casual assurance of someone who'd never been pregnant. "Women have been doing this since Eve." "And complaining about it just as long," Eleanor muttered, making James laugh. The heat brought challenges beyond Eleanor's discomfort. Water became scarce as the creek ran low, and James spent long days with the hands moving cattle to better grazing. Eleanor managed what she could from the house, keeping the garden alive with careful water management, preserving everything she could against the lean months that might come. It was during one of those blazing afternoons that Patrick arrived unexpectedly, his city clothes wilting in the heat. He'd sent no word of his coming, and Eleanor found him at her door looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "Patrick, what brings you here?" I wanted to see James," And you? How are you? His eyes went to her obvious pregnancy. I see congratulations are in order. Thank you. James is out with the cattle, but he should be back by evening. Come in. Get out of this heat. Patrick followed her inside, accepting the cold tea she offered gratefully. He seemed different from the suspicious man who'd attended their wedding, older somehow, though only months had passed. I owe you another apology, he said abruptly, and an explanation. You owe me nothing, Eleanor said, lowering herself carefully into a chair. I do. You see, I was engaged myself back in San Francisco. A beautiful woman, perfect society credentials, everything a rising doctor could want in a wife. His voice turned bitter. Turned out she was more interested in my projected income than in me. She broke the engagement when she found someone wealthier. I'm sorry, Eleanor said genuinely. It made me suspicious of everyone's motives, especially women who seem to need rescue. But watching you and James at your wedding, seeing how you looked at each other, I realized I'd been projecting my own disappointment onto your situation. Love makes fools of us all, one way or another, Eleanor said gently. James is lucky to have you. This ranch, this life. It never made sense to me, but seeing him now versus 3 years ago, you've brought him back to life. James arrived home to find his brother helping Eleanor with dinner, the two of them working in companionable harmony that made him stop in the doorway and stare. Don't just stand there gaping, Eleanor said without turning around. Wash up and set the table. She orders me around constantly, James told Patrick with a grin. It's wonderful. That evening, the three of them sat on the porch as the heat finally began to break. Patrick shared news from San Francisco, the medical advances he was studying, his plans to specialize in surgery. But Eleanor noticed how his eyes kept drifting to the mountains, the vast sky, the peace that seemed to emanate from the land itself. You could practice here, James said quietly. Willow Springs needs a real doctor, not just Doc Watson who learned his trade in the war. I'm a city doctor, Patrick protested. I wouldn't know what to do with gunshot wounds and horse kicks. You'd learn, Eleanor said. We all learn things we never expected out here. Patrick stayed 3 days, and by the time he left, something had shifted in the brothers' relationship. The old ease was returning, the shared jokes and comfortable silences that had been strained since Sarah's death and James's withdrawal. Thank you, James said to Eleanor that night, for being kind to him despite his earlier behavior. He's your family, Eleanor said simply. That makes him mine. July crept by in a haze of heat and increasing discomfort. Eleanor could barely sleep, the baby active at all hours, her back aching constantly. She gave up any pretense of normal activity, spending her days in the coolest part of the house, teaching the Valley children from a rocking chair, directing Rosa's daughter Maria, who'd come to help with the household work. It was on one of those interminable July afternoons that her water broke, sudden and unexpected, while she was shelving books in the parlor. For a moment she stood frozen, liquid pooling at her feet, before the first contraction hit with enough force to drive her to her knees. Maria! She called, her voice tight with pain and fear. Get James, now! What followed was 18 hours of labor that tested Eleanor in ways she hadn't imagined possible. James stayed beside her, letting her crush his hands during contractions, wiping her face with cool cloths, whispering encouragement when she swore she couldn't continue. Doc Watson arrived after 8 hours, took one look, and announced the baby was turned wrong. We need to reposition it, he said grimly. This is going to hurt. It already hurts, Eleanor gasped between contractions. What he did next made everything before seem like gentle discomfort. Eleanor screamed, dignity abandoned, as the doctor manually turned the baby. James went white, but held her steady, his strength the only thing anchoring her to sanity. That's it, Doc Watson said with satisfaction. Head down now. Should progress normally from here. Normally? Eleanor panted. This is normal? As normal as birth ever is, the doctor said with infuriating calm. 10 more hours of pushing, sweating, cursing in ways that would have horrified her Boston relatives. And finally, a cry that wasn't hers filled the room. Doc Watson lifted a squalling, red-faced infant, a girl, perfect and furious at her eviction from the womb. A daughter, James breathed, tears streaming down his face, as the doctor placed the baby on Eleanor's chest. Our daughter. Eleanor looked down at the tiny face, the shock of dark hair, the little fists waving in protest, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. This child, born of struggle and love in equal measure, was the living proof that her journey west had been worth every moment of pain and uncertainty. "What shall we call her?" James asked, his finger stroking the baby's impossibly soft cheek. "Sarah," Eleanor said without hesitation. "Sarah Hope McAllister, for the past that shaped us and the future we're building." James kissed her then, careful of the baby between them, and Eleanor tasted salt from both their tears. Outside, dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. A new day, a new life, a new chapter in their continuing story. Margaret arrived that afternoon, having received word from one of the hands James had sent to town. She took one look at the baby and burst into tears. "She looks like Mother," she said, gathering her niece with practiced ease. "Same chin, same stubborn set to the mouth. She'll be a force to reckon with." "Like her aunt," Eleanor said with a tired smile. "And her mother," Margaret countered. "The woman who survived abandonment, rebuilt her life, tamed my brother, and just brought new life into this world. That's a force of nature if ever I saw one." As Eleanor drifted off to sleep, exhausted but content, she could hear James in the next room, singing softly to their daughter, an old cowboy lullaby about sleeping under stars and riding the range. Through the window, she could see the ranch stretching out toward the mountains, the cattle grazing peacefully, the garden she'd planted thriving despite the heat. This was her life now, not the one she'd imagined when she'd answered Thomas Whitmore's letters, not the one she'd planned when she'd left Boston with such hope. It was harder than she'd expected, lonelier at times, more demanding physically and emotionally than any Eastern drawing room could have prepared her for. But it was also richer, truer, more satisfying than any fantasy could have been. She thought about that scared girl on the depot platform, certain her life was over. What would she think if she could see Eleanor now? A ranch wife, a mother, a teacher, a vital part of a community that valued strength over style, truth over pretense? Would she believe that such transformation was possible? "Your journey ends with me," James had said that day, buying her ticket to what she'd thought was just another destination. But he'd been right in ways neither of them could have imagined. Her journey as a desperate, abandoned woman had ended when he'd shown her kindness without expectation. What had begun was a new journey entirely, one of choosing rather than being chosen, of building rather than hoping, of loving with eyes wide open rather than desperately closed. Baby Sarah fussed, and Eleanor heard James's footsteps bringing their daughter to nurse. He helped Eleanor position the baby, then sat beside them on the bed, his arm around both his women, protective and proud. "No regrets?" he asked, echoing his question from their wedding day. Eleanor looked at their daughter's perfect face, felt James's solid warmth beside her, heard the ranch coming alive with another day's work, and knew her answer with bone-deep certainty. "Not a single one," she said. "This is exactly where I was meant to be." The depot at Silver Creek was just a memory now, a turning point in a story that had led to this moment, this life, this love. The cowboy had indeed bought her fare, and her journey had indeed ended with him. But more than that, it had begun with him too, a journey into herself, into strength she didn't know she possessed, into a love built on truth rather than fantasy. As Sarah nursed contentedly and James hummed that cowboy lullaby, Eleanor closed her eyes and smiled. She was home. Not the home she'd planned or expected, but the home she'd earned through courage, perseverance, and the willingness to let go of pretty lies in favor of beautiful truths. The abandoned woman at the depot was gone, transformed into someone stronger, someone real, someone worthy of the love that surrounded her. The story that had begun with betrayal and desperation had become something else entirely, a testament to resilience, to the unexpected gifts that come from surviving our worst fears, and to the truth that sometimes the journey we never planned is exactly the one we needed to take.